In the vast, glittering, god-soaked pantheon of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were practically part-time deities and tradition was more sacred than a pyramid's pointy bit, one man stood up and said, "What if we just didn't do any of that anymore?" His name, Amenhotep IV. His vibes, initially pretty standard pharaoh fare. His legacy, one of the most bizarre, controversial and vanishing acts in ancient history. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic, why an ancient Egyptian ruler was erased from time, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's rewind to the 14th century BCE, around 1350. Give or take a few mummies, Egypt was in the middle of its New Kingdom period, an era when the empire was flush with gold, gods and monuments so massive you could spot them from a chariot with poor eyesight. Amenhotep IV, born into the plush lap of dynasty Aten, was the son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who had ruled for nearly 4 decades and was basically the Beyoncé of Egyptian rulers, adored, powerful, and very into elaborate temples. Now, as young Amenhotep IV took the throne, everything seemed pretty chill. He had the royal pedigree, a queen named Nefertiti, who would one day become just as famous as him, and definitely more stylish, and access to a divine PR team of priests who handled Egypt's thousands of gods with the enthusiasm of a full-time wedding planning staff. And for a while, Amenhotep IV played by the rules. He made offerings to Amun, the head honcho god. He attended festivals. He wore the hat. You know the one, the double crown that screams, "I rule both Upper and Lower Egypt, and I have neck pain now." But then, something shifted. About 5 years into his reign, Amenhotep IV looked at the entire Egyptian religious structure, gods upon gods, temples upon temples, priests doing elaborate rituals with feathered fans, and went, "Nope, too much, too messy, let's streamline this." This is the point in the story where things start to spiral into historical fever dream territory. Without consulting, well, anyone, Amenhotep IV decided Egypt didn't need 1,000 gods. No Osiris, no Isis, no Horus, no jackal-headed Anubis or falcon-faced Ra. He picked one, Aten, the literal sun disk, not a sun god with a cool personality, mind you, just the glowing circle in the sky. It was like unfollowing everyone on Instagram and only liking your own posts. And to reflect this radical religious pivot, he gave himself a total rebrand. Goodbye Amenhotep IV. Hello Akhenaten, a name meaning effective for aten. You know you're serious about your new ideology when you rename yourself like a spiritual startup. Suddenly, temples were closed. Priests were out of a job. Whole traditions got thrown into the royal recycling bin. Akhenaten wasn't just tweaking policy, he was lighting the theological rulebook on fire and using it to roast marshmallows under the blazing sun of his new god. Now you might be thinking, surely this didn't go over well, and you'd be correct, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's sit in the bizarre reality that Akhenaten, a man born into a polytheistic empire where even cats had their own gods, looked at the religious system and decided to strip it down to one celestial emoji in the sky. Even his art changed. But don't worry, we'll get to the full alien-looking family portrait breakdown later. What's essential to understand in this opening chapter is just how deeply weird and deeply revolutionary Akhenaten's move was. Ancient Egyptian religion wasn't just belief, it was infrastructure. It ran the calendar, the taxes, the agriculture, and basically your chances of having a good afterlife. Choosing to chuck all that out was like waking up and deciding water is cancelled. And yet, he did it. He ruled for 17 years. That's not a quick reign, that's a full Netflix original series arc. Somehow, he maintained power through this bizarre experiment, reshaping one of the most spiritually complex civilizations on Earth into a monotheistic state centered around a ball of fire in the sky. But here's the kicker. After his death, it was like Egypt collectively tried to forget he ever existed. Monuments were smashed. His name was erased. His city was abandoned. Priests went into full damage control mode, scrubbing Akhenaten's sun-splashed rain from the walls of history like someone trying to delete their MySpace page before applying for a job. He started off ruling Egypt. He ended up ruling nothing, not even a decent Google search result. So why did he do it? Visionary reformer? Egotistical cult leader? A man with too much sunscreen and not enough advisors? That's what the rest of this story will explore. Because Akhenaten didn't just break the rules, he torched them with sun worship and then vanished into historical obscurity like a magician who accidentally made himself disappear. Welcome to the strangest reign in ancient Egyptian history. Grab your linen robe and some protective eyewear. It's about to get bright. Religion in ancient Egypt was less of a belief system and more of an everything system. Gods didn't just exist, they micromanaged. They handled the weather, the Nile, fertility, architecture, war, bread, beer, cats, and even bowel movements. Seriously, look up the god Kabir Snoef. It was like living in a celestial HOA where every minor aspect of your day had divine supervision. Now imagine Akhenaten walking into that, clearing his throat, and announcing, "Hey, so, I've been thinking, we only really need one god. And good news, it's the sun. Plot twist, there's only one god now, and it's the sun. Deal with it." This wasn't a theological tweak. This was a religious reset button, so hard it broke the keyboard. Enter Aten, not Ra, the familiar sun god with the falcon head, but Aten, the literal sun disk. Just a flat circle of glowing daylight. No personality, no mythology, no animal hybrid body parts, just brightness. Aten didn't bother with festivals or parables or battling snake demons in the underworld. He floated silently overhead, casting holy sunbeams like a divine desk lamp with excellent coverage. And to Akhenaten, that was the point. Akhenaten was pure, abstract, untouchable. No messy stories, no complicated priesthood, just radiant authority beaming down from the heavens. In Akhenaten's eyes, Akhenaten wasn't just the supreme god, he was the only god worth acknowledging. Everything else? Out. This kicked off what might be the world's first recorded instance of forced monotheism. Akhenaten began scrubbing Egypt clean of its polytheistic traditions like a history major with a chisel, and way too much power. Temples to other gods, closed. Priests of Amun, Osiris, Thoth, Bastet, and the rest, fired. Sacred rituals passed down for centuries, cancelled faster than a celebrity on Twitter. And this wasn't a subtle operation. Akhenaten went full scorched earth, literally chipping out the names of other gods from monuments, removing their images, and in some cases physically destroying entire temple complexes. If Amun had a Yelp page, it now read, "This user no longer exists." He even banned the use of the plural term gods in inscriptions. That's right, grammar was now monotheistic. But why Aten? Why now? Historians still debate it. Some say Akhenaten had a genuine spiritual awakening, that he believed Aten was the universal force behind all life, too divine to be depicted in human or animal form. Others suggest it was a cunning power grab. By abolishing the traditional gods, Akhenaten also cut off the influential priesthoods who served them, essentially gutting a parallel power structure that had long rivaled the pharaoh's authority. Now, if you wanted divine favor, there was only one place to get it, through him. This made Akhenaten not just the king but the high priest of the only god in town, a one-man religious monopoly. Think of him as pharaoh, pope, and CEO of Divine Light Incorporated, all rolled into one. He wasn't just changing how people prayed, he was changing how they thought about the universe. Akhenaten wasn't cozy. Akhenaten wasn't a listening god. Akhenaten didn't fight evil or smite enemies. Akhenaten just shone. His rays reached out like fingers in artwork, ending in little hands that gently offered Ankhs, the Egyptian symbol of life. There was no divine drama, no juicy myths, just warmth, constant, inescapable warmth, like being spiritually sunburned. Naturally, this didn't sit well with everyone. The average Egyptian family who had been praying to Anubis to watch over grandma's mummification, suddenly found themselves spiritually unemployed. Entire religious careers were wiped out overnight. Imagine training your whole life to be a priest of Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, only to be told, sorry, the sun disk doesn't do academic support. Even the way Egyptians worshipped changed. Instead of sacred temples full of mystery and shadow, Aten's temples were open air, no roof, just sunshine pouring in. Because of course the sun god needed full UV access. Offerings were made to Aten via Akhenaten himself, meaning the average citizen had no direct connection to the divine. If you wanted to pray, you had to go through the big guy. No gods, no intermediaries, no refunds. It's hard to overstate just how jarring this was. For thousands of years, Egyptians believed in a delicate cosmic balance. Gods lived in the sky, the underworld, the Nile, the stars, your pet cat. Suddenly, that spiritual ecosystem was flattened into a giant glowing pancake, and the only person with SPF clearance was the pharaoh. The sun had risen, yes, but so had unrest, confusion, and a whole lot of skeptical side-eye from both the people and the elite. Akhenaten had started a revolution, whether it was born from piety, power, or just a really intense sunburn. It was clear that Egypt would never be quite the same again, and this was only the beginning. If Akhenaten had a catchphrase, it would probably be, "Why fix what's broken when you can destroy it, rebuild it in the desert, and say it was divine inspiration?" Because after tossing Egypt's gods into the theological trash bin, Akhenaten looked at the entire capital city of Thebes, home to centuries of royal power, sacred temples and political infrastructure, and said, "Nah, let's move." And move he did. But not just across the river or a few neighborhoods down. No, Akhenaten went full dramatic and decided to build an entirely new city from scratch in the middle of a desert basin. A place where nothing had ever been built before. No older settlements, no religious history, no Starbucks. He called it Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. Back then, it was what happens when a megalomaniac gets both religious authority and access to a massive construction workforce. And here's the kicker, Akhenaten didn't just build it and hope people would come. He ordered the entire government to move with him, like a divine company retreat, but permanent, and with far fewer snacks. Royal scribes, bureaucrats, architects, artists, cooks, and guards all packed up their scrolls and linen and hauled it 200 miles north of Thebes to a location that had approximately the same real estate appeal as a microwaved sandcastle. Why that specific spot? According to inscriptions, Akhenaten claimed he saw the location in a vision from Aten. The sun god supposedly said, "Build here." Conveniently, here was a flat patch of desert surrounded by cliffs, with a perfect view of the sunrise and zero shade. In short, the worst Airbnb listing in all of ancient Egypt. But Akhenaten wasn't just building a city, he was building a statement. This wasn't about location, resources, or convenience. It was a radical act of architectural worship. The city would face the rising sun. Temples would have no roof so Akhenat's rays could shine directly in. And most importantly, no other god had ever set a divine foot in that region. Akhenaten made sure of that. How sure? He carved into stone boundary stelae, massive rock markers that encircled the site, and wrote, in classic pharaoh humble brag style, that no god had ever claimed this land, and no human had ever lived there before. Imagine going out of your way to say, "I'm the first, and I'll be the best," and no one's allowed to forget it. The ego was so bright it needed its own sunshade. Construction began almost immediately, and since pharaohs don't exactly wait for planning permits, the city sprang up like a limestone mushroom. Royal palaces, temples, homes for nobles, administrative buildings all carved, painted and plastered in record time. Workers labored day and night under the very sun they were now required to worship, building a city that looked less like a metropolis and more like a divine film set. Everything was aten-themed, sunbeam adjacent, and aggressively radiant. The city's crown jewel was the great temple of the Aten, a massive open-air complex that looked like someone had torn the roof off a cathedral and said, "Perfect. Forget dark incense-filled chambers." This was sun worship with full solar exposure. You could practically get a tan while praying. Even the royal palace was different. Instead of secluded, shadowy halls like past rulers preferred, Akhenaten's residence was long, bright and open. It connected to various public areas with a kind of visibility no previous pharaoh had ever allowed. Was it a political statement? A way to stay close to the people? Or was he just really into vitamin D? Hard to say. Meanwhile, the average citizen lived in quickly assembled mud brick homes that made the city look more like a temporary pop-up village than a long-lasting capital. There were bakeries, workshops and street layouts, but it all felt rushed, temporary and experimental, like Egypt's most elaborate group project with a very short deadline. Still, for a brief time it worked. Akhenaten became the beating heart of Akhenaten's new religious vision. Priests of Aten walked around in long white robes, carefully positioning themselves to catch the sun's rays like spiritual solar panels. Artisans churned out images of the royal family basking in Aten's glow, and the entire city revolved around this one celestial spotlight. It was sunshine or bust. But underneath all the stone and sunbeams, the foundations were shaky, literally and politically. The city had no real infrastructure beyond what was rapidly thrown together. It lacked the spiritual roots of older cities like Thebes or Memphis. It was all Aten, all the time, no plan B. And that made Akhenaten a capital built not on stone but on ideology. It's like moving your entire country to a sandpit because you like the lighting. Akhenaten wasn't building for legacy, he was building a theological dreamscape with a deadline. And the moment the dream ended, so did the city. But for now, it stood proud, shimmering in the sun, a glowing monument to one man's belief that he could reshape the world with a chisel, a sunbeam, and some deeply committed ego. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian art had been the picture of consistency. Rigid profiles, perfect symmetry, idealized bodies, and expressions so neutral they made modern passport photos look emotional. Pharaohs were square-jawed demigods, wives were graceful and perfect, and children were tiny adults with unsettlingly mature posture. The message was clear: order, power, and eternal divine perfection. And then Akhenaten said, "What if we looked like actual people, but also kind of like melting aliens? Welcome to the Amarna art style, the aesthetic revolution no one asked for, featuring enough creative license to make traditionalists cry into their stone tablets." Let's start with the pharaoh himself. In this new visual language, Akhenaten is no longer portrayed as a chiseled war god with a six-pack and a square jaw. No, sir. Instead, he's shown with a long egg-shaped skull, a skinny neck, narrow sloping shoulders, and what can only be described as a pronounced dad bod. His belly curves out, his hips widen, and his thighs swell like he's preparing for a fertility dance-off. Honestly, if aliens ever did visit ancient Egypt, this is probably how they'd expect to be painted. But this wasn't a one-time artistic fluke. It was deliberate, repeated again and again in statues, carvings, wall reliefs and shrines. This new body type became the official visual signature of Akhenaten's reign. No more godlike perfection. Now the pharaoh looked softer, rounder, more human, and possibly like he was made of Play-Doh left in the sun too long. So why the change? Scholars have argued over this for decades. One theory suggests religious symbolism, that the weird proportions reflected Akhenaten's role as a bridge between male and female, God and man, form and formlessness. His curving body might have been meant to show completeness, both fertile and divine, both human and holy. Another theory: the guy had a medical condition, Marfan syndrome, Froschlich syndrome, or just a bad back and a flexible art director. Take your pick. But the truth is, we don't actually know if Akhenaten looked like this in real life. What we do know is that he wanted to be remembered this way, and that's weird enough. But wait, it gets weirder. Because Amarna art didn't stop with royal portraits that looked like claymation experiments. It also completely changed how pharaohs were shown interacting with their families. Before this period, royal affection in Egyptian art was, let's say, minimal. Pharaohs might stand next to their wives. They might gently hold a staff while their children stood silently nearby. But emotions, expressions, physical affection? Forget it. Under Akhenaten's new artistic rules, that all changed. Suddenly, the pharaoh was shown in domestic bliss, cradling babies, kissing his daughters, lounging under the rays of Aten like the sun was a family therapist. It was so warm and cuddly, you'd think Aten's rays were made of cocoa and bedtime stories. In one famous relief, Akhenaten and Nefertiti sit side by side, legs crossed casually like they're about to record a family podcast. Their daughters climb into their laps, while the sun disk Aten beams down its signature rays, each ending in little hands gently touching the royal family. The whole thing radiates divine intimacy, with just a touch of cultish spa retreat. For the first time, a royal family portrait looked less like divine beings and more like a yoga class sponsored by a cult. The emotional honesty is startling. The pharaoh isn't towering over the world, he's playing peekaboo with his kids. The queen isn't just ornamental, she's actively mothering, co-ruling, and looking like she might ask someone to pass the hummus at any moment. And it wasn't just about posture and hugs, even the faces changed. Earlier pharaohs had expressions carved from granite, literally and figuratively. Akhenaten's artists, by contrast, dared to show wrinkles, frowns, laughter lines, even exhaustion. It's as if they collectively said, you know what, maybe divine rulers get tired too. Of course, none of this sat well with traditional Egypt. This wasn't art anymore, it was propaganda in a radically different visual dialect. The elite must have gawked at these depictions like a grandma discovering emojis for the first time. What do you mean the pharaoh is cuddling? To the conservative establishment, these images were dangerous. They blurred lines between mortal and divine. They made the pharaoh feel real, maybe too real. And when Akhenaten fell, as he inevitably did, this entire visual world went down with him. In later years, Amarna art would be systematically destroyed, chipped away from stone walls, buried, hidden and ignored. Sculptures were smashed, reliefs were covered with new plaster, and future pharaohs went back to the old art style, square jaws, stiff poses and all the warmth of a limestone statue. But for that one weird moment in time, Egyptian art took a detour into emotional surrealism. It was vulnerable, intimate, and just a little bit alien, because in Akhenaten's Egypt, you didn't just rule with power, you ruled with eyeliner, belly rolls, and family cuddles under a giant celestial heat lamp. In the grand lineup of ancient Egyptian queens, Nefertiti stands out like a Beyoncé at a history convention. She's not just famous, she's iconic, with a name that literally means the beautiful one has come. And thanks to that impossibly symmetrical limestone bust now living rent-free in a Berlin museum, she's become ancient Egypt's unofficial poster queen. But don't be fooled by the cheekbones. Nefertiti wasn't just a pretty face. Behind that elegant gaze was a political force strong enough to rival the pharaoh himself or possibly replace him entirely. Let's rewind a bit. When Akhenaten, still Amenhotep IV at the time, took the throne, he already had Nefertiti by his side. We don't know her origins for sure. Her parentage is a historical shrug, but she may have been related to a high-ranking noble or priest. Some theories even claim she was the daughter of Ai, a powerful official who later became pharaoh himself. Either way, she didn't marry into obscurity. From the start, Nefertiti was front and center. Most Egyptian queens showed up in a handful of temple reliefs and maybe a tomb or two. Nefertiti? She was everywhere, carved into walls, painted in murals, depicted smiting enemies, which was usually Pharaoh's thing, and offering sacrifices to Aten like she owned the temple. And maybe, just maybe, she did. Because during Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti wasn't just a consort. She was a co-ruler, possibly even a co-messiah in the new Aten religion. The art and inscriptions show her standing beside Akhenaten in equal size and stature, which in ancient Egyptian art is basically the equivalent of sharing the throne and the Netflix password. She wears the blue crown of kingship. She performs priestly rites. She even has her own temple dedicated to Aten. At some points, it's hard to tell who's in charge. Akhenaten was busy spiritually sunbathing and orchestrating a one-god revolution. Meanwhile, Nefertiti was handling business, possibly acting as diplomat, administrator and religious figure all in one. Honestly, she might have been the only person keeping the whole Akhenaten operation from spiraling into sun-worshipping chaos. That's why some historians have given her the unofficial title of ancient Egypt's first spin doctor, a kind of divine PR manager who kept Akhenaten's wildly unpopular religious changes from becoming a total train wreck. Think Olivia Pope, but in linen and eyeliner. And then, she vanished. Roughly year 12 of Akhenaten's 17-year reign, Nefertiti disappears from the records. Poof, gone. No inscriptions, no mentions, no tomb clearly labeled with her name, just silence. Like someone hit the delete key on history's most visible queen. So what happened? Well, theories abound like vultures at a desert picnic. Theory 1. She died. Simple, tragic, and surprisingly convenient. Maybe illness or childbirth took her out early, and her name was quietly omitted for political or religious reasons. But this theory doesn't explain the suddenness or why a queen that prominent wouldn't get a flashy royal burial. Theory 2. She fell out of favor. Maybe she challenged Akhenaten's authority. Maybe they clashed over religious policy. Or maybe she just got tired of kissing the sun good morning. In this version, she's demoted or even exiled. Divorce, ancient Egypt style. Theory 3. She became pharaoh. Yep, some scholars believe Nefertiti didn't disappear at all, she just rebranded. There's a mysterious pharaoh named Smenkhkare, who shows up shortly before Akhenaten's death, ruling for a hot minute before vanishing as well. Some think Smenkhkare was Nefertiti in disguise, ruling under a new name to preserve the throne and the fragile Aten cult during Egypt's weirdest religious midlife crisis. Others take it a step further, suggesting she may have ruled alone after Akhenaten's death, possibly under the name Neferu Aten, a female pharaoh who definitely existed, but whose identity is fuzzier than a hieroglyphic sketchpad. If true, this means Nefertiti pulled off the greatest power move in ancient history. She went from queen to pharaoh to ghost, and left generations of Egyptologists arguing in circles ever since. Of course, ancient Egypt had a habit of hiding inconvenient people, and if Nefertiti was seen as part of the failed Aten experiment, later rulers had every reason to erase her from the record, just like Akhenaten himself. Out of sight, out of shrine. But what's fascinating is that her image endured anyway. That now famous bust, discovered in 1912 in the ruins of Amarna, remains one of the most recognizable faces in the world. With her calm expression and laser-perfect bone structure, she looks less like a pharaoh's wife and more like someone about to drop a skincare routine. But the real power of that sculpture isn't just in its artistry, it's in the mystery. Who was she really? A queen? A ruler? A political genius wrapped in linen robes? She was either Egypt's power behind the throne or the one who said, "I'm out," and vanished like historical smoke. Whichever version you choose to believe, one thing's for sure, Nefertiti didn't just live in Akhenaten's shadow. She stood right beside him, sometimes with a crown, sometimes with a sword, and sometimes perhaps with an exit plan. If you ever want to test the patience of a 3,000-year-old civilization, here's a tip. Cancel all their gods, move the capital to the middle of nowhere, tank the economy, and then force everyone to pretend it's a spiritual upgrade. That's exactly what Akhenaten did. And the Egyptian people? They were not vibing. On paper, Akhenaten's aten-centered vision might have seemed like a bold leap into a brighter, more unified future. In reality, it felt more like someone replaced your religious cable package with a single static channel and charged you extra for it. Let's start with the obvious, spiritual confusion. For centuries, Egyptians had a highly detailed spiritual system. Every town had a patron deity, every trade had its own protective spirit, and every family had a favorite god or goddess to bribe for good crops and safe childbirth. It wasn't just belief, it was cosmic customer service. If your donkey broke a leg, you prayed to one god. If your crops failed, you lit incense to another. There was a divine hotline for everything. So when Akhenaten rolled in and said, "Actually, it's just the sun now," people didn't exactly cheer. Instead, they stared at their altars and went, "Wait, what happens to my afterlife plan?" Because, let's be clear, Akhenaten had no comforting mythology, no underworld journey, no judgment of the soul, no feather on the scale moral measuring. Under Atenism, the whole system of life after death, the very thing Egyptians obsessed over, got extremely blurry. What happens when you die now? Do you just get tanned forever? Unsurprisingly, this spiritual uncertainty led to widespread anxiety. Regular Egyptians who had relied on rituals, prayers and offerings to maintain harmony with the gods suddenly found themselves spiritually unemployed. You can't just ghost an entire pantheon without consequences. And speaking of unemployment, let's talk about the priests. For centuries, priesthoods were powerful. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic engines managing land, granaries, livestock and labor. Temples owned farms, employed scribes and artisans, and even loaned grain like divine banks. The priests of Amun in Thebes were particularly influential, basically the Vatican of ancient Egypt, but with more jackal statues. Akhenaten nuked that structure with the finesse of a toddler with a sledgehammer. Temples to the old gods, closed, their land and assets, confiscated, their priests, out of work. Imagine being a respected priest of Ptah for 40 years, only to be told your god has been decommissioned like an expired yogurt. This wasn't just religious, it was financial sabotage. Egypt's economy took a hit. Thousands of workers dependent on temple infrastructure, farmers, scribes, builders, merchants, suddenly lost their income streams. The redistribution of wealth to Aten's new temples in Akhetaten wasn't enough to patch the hole. Thebes, once the religious and economic heart of the nation, became a ghost town of angry priests and disillusioned citizens. Meanwhile, back in the sun-drenched utopia of Akhetaten, the cracks were starting to show. The city may have glowed with Aten's sacred rays, but it was poorly located for long-term survival. The desert terrain was harsh, resources were limited, and support from the traditional centers of power was lukewarm at best. Add to that famine, which struck during the later years of Akhenaten's reign, likely due to drought and poor harvests, and you've got a population that's not just confused, they're starving, jobless and spiritually homeless. And let's not forget the soldiers. Egypt's military was used to serving under pharaohs, who invoked the power of multiple gods to bless their conquests. Now, under Atenism, divine support had been narrowed down to a giant disk in the sky with no mythological resume. Marching into battle under the power of flat sun with arms wasn't exactly a morale booster. It turns out if you cancel everyone's gods and throw the economy into chaos, people don't send thank you notes. In fact, they seethe, quietly, maybe, because Akhenaten was still pharaoh, and you didn't want to get on the bad side of someone who believed he was the only conduit to the one remaining god. But resentment was growing, like a poorly managed irrigation canal, threatening to flood everything in its path. And yet, Akhenaten either didn't notice or didn't care. He continued to pour resources into Akhenat's cult, kept sending offerings into the sky, and surrounded himself with loyal elites who echoed his vision. Meanwhile, the rest of Egypt was wilting. Cities like Memphis and Thebes, which had once pulsed with divine and political life, were now watching the sun god experiment from the sidelines, arms crossed and eyebrows raised. The writing was on the sandstone. While Akhenaten may have envisioned a new spiritual golden age, the everyday reality was a kingdom unraveling socially, economically, and religiously. The people were grumpy, the priests were furious, and the sun, for all its rays, was not taking complaints. The aten might have shone brightly from the heavens, but down below, Egypt was burning out. One day, Akhenaten was the sun-obsessed pharaoh of a custom-built city, basking in the divine glow of his one and only god. The next, he vanished. No grand burial, no glorious tomb, no record of how or even when he died. Just poof. It's history's version of a page not found error. For someone who spent nearly 2 decades turning Egypt upside down, erasing gods, rewriting religion, relocating the capital, and immortalizing himself in surreal art, you'd think his exit would be equally dramatic. A flaming chariot into the sun, perhaps, or a final decree written in beams of light. But no, Akhenaten's death is one of the murkiest drop-offs in ancient history. Let's start with what we don't know: everything. There's no surviving official record of his death, no carved wall relief announcing his glorious departure to the afterlife, no royal mummy we can point to and say, "Yup, that's our weird sun guy." There's not even a solid date. Historians estimate his reign ended around year 17, but that's a shrug at best. So naturally the speculation floodgates opened. Was it natural causes? Maybe. He could have died of illness. Age or stress, being Egypt's most controversial reformer, surely came with high blood pressure. There are theories about potential health conditions, Marfan syndrome, endocrine disorders that may have contributed to an early death. But without a body, it's all educated guesswork. Then again, maybe it wasn't natural. Some suspect a coup, a quiet, behind the sand dunes kind of rebellion, with the priesthood angry, the military lukewarm, and the public losing faith faster than a drought-struck Nile. It's not a stretch to imagine someone deciding the sun had set on Akhenaten's reign, and if he was assassinated or forced to abdicate, that might explain why his legacy was buried faster than a heretical house cat. What makes the mystery even stranger is what happened immediately afterward. Enter the enigma of Smenkhkare. This is the name of a pharaoh who ruled briefly after Akhenaten's disappearance, maybe a year or two, tops. Who was he? Another royal son? A younger brother? A political placeholder? The records are vague, which is ancient Egypt's way of saying we don't talk about Smenkhkare. Even weirder, some scholars argue that Smenkhkare was actually Nefertiti in disguise, ruling under a male name to keep the Aten regime afloat. It's not as wild as it sounds. Egypt had a long tradition of women taking on kingly roles when necessary, and considering Nefertiti's deep involvement in royal and religious affairs, she's a prime suspect. Whoever Smenkhkare was, his rule was short-lived, foggy, and largely forgettable, a flicker of sun before the eclipse. Then came the Great Reset. After the Aten experiment collapsed under the weight of its own weirdness, Egypt responded like a household cleaning up after a very bad party. They didn't just move on, they actively purged. Akhenaten abandoned, Akhenaten temples shut down, names of Akhenaten and his family chiseled off stone like divine graffiti. It was a full-scale religious control flood. The traditional gods were reinstated, their temples reopened, and the old priesthood came back like... Anyway, where were we? Even the capital moved back to Thebes, as if everyone had collectively agreed that desert sun cults were fun for a season but not exactly civilization material. And then, just to make it crystal clear, Akhenaten's name was scrubbed from the king lists. Ancient Egyptians didn't mess around. When they wanted to erase someone, they made it a group project. His monuments were smashed, his images defaced, and his successors pretended he never existed. He became what scholars call a heretic king, a taboo figure whispered about but officially forgotten. For the Egyptians, erasing him wasn't just political revenge, it was cosmic damage control. His monotheism had disturbed Moat, the sacred balance of the universe. Deleting him was like sealing a cursed tomb for safety. So where's Akhenaten now? Well, that's another mystery. Some mummies have been proposed as his, most notably one found in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings. But the identity is disputed. DNA analysis suggests a close relative of Tutankhamun, possibly his father, which Akhenaten likely was, but there's no solid inscription confirming it. It's a fitting ending or lack of one for a pharaoh who rewrote the rules, only to be buried by the very tradition he tried to dismantle. And what about his dream of Aten worship? It flickered briefly under his successors, then vanished entirely. Within a generation, Egypt had gone back to business as usual. Multi-gods, temple festivals, cat worship and all. The sun had set on Akhenaten's revolution, and it wasn't coming back up. He may have believed he was ushering in a divine new era. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a brief, blinding flare in Egypt's long history, strange, radical, and utterly rejected. Still, one can't help but marvel at the boldness. Not many people get erased from history and rediscovered thousands of years later, only to confuse every historian who studies them. Akhenaten's final legacy, a mystery wrapped in sandstone, buried in silence, and illuminated by a sun god no one believed in anymore. When you hear the name Tutankhamun, your brain probably goes straight to glittering gold, cursed tombs, and at least one History Channel documentary involving aliens. But long before his mummy launched 1,000 conspiracy theories, King Tut was just a kid handed the keys to the weirdest kingdom in ancient Egypt. His dad probably was Akhenaten, the sun-obsessed pharaoh who torched 2,000 years of religious tradition and said, "Let's start over with one god and no backup plan." So when Akhenaten vanished into the dusty haze of mystery, guess who got to mop up the cosmic mess? Tutankhamun, as he was originally named. Yes, that's Aten, the sun god, right there in the middle of his birth name, like a celestial watermark. But this kid wouldn't keep it for long. When Tut came to power around the age of 8 or 9, Egypt was spiritually confused, politically shaky, economically exhausted, and still blinking from all the unfiltered sunlight of the Aten years. The temples were shut down, the priesthoods had been gutted, the capital was a glorified sandbox, and the public was so done with theology experiments they might as well have invented sarcasm. So what did little Tut do? He hit undo on everything. First step, change the branding. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, swapping the aten for Amun, one of the most beloved and long-standing gods of the traditional pantheon. It was like switching your profile picture from a sun disk to a safe, reliable god with a strong beard game. It wasn't just a personal choice, it was a public statement. The old gods are back. No more experimental solar theology, thank you very much. Tut's reign became a full-blown Make Egypt Normal Again campaign. He reopened temples, he restored priesthoods, he issued decrees that promised spiritual healing and political stability. Statues of Amun and his fellow deities were dusted off and polished. Festivals were back on the calendar. It was like a divine block party, and everyone was invited. And don't forget the propaganda. Official inscriptions from Tut's reign are full of glowing statements about how the gods were pleased again. Cosmic order was restored, and Egypt was back on track, all thanks to the young king and his advisors. It was part spiritual revival, part PR rebrand, and part political survival. After all, nobody wanted to be linked to the Akhenaten years unless they were trying to get uninvited from every sacred event. But make no mistake, Tut wasn't steering this ship alone. At such a young age, the real power behind the lotus-patterned throne was held by two key figures, possibly his grandfather, a high-ranking advisor, and Horemheb, a military general with sharp elbows and an even sharper sense of what Egypt needed. These men were the architects of the restoration. Tutankhamun may have worn the crown, but they were the ones who quietly made the decisions rebuilding temples, managing resources, and slowly, methodically deleting Atenism from the records like it was an embarrassing phase everyone agreed not to talk about. Aten temples were defunded and left to decay. The city of Akhenaten, Amarna, was abandoned. Images of Akhenaten and his sun god were chipped off walls like divine graffiti, being power-washed into oblivion. And just to really make the point, the royal tombs were moved back to traditional sites in the Valley of the Kings. Out with the sun, in with the shadows. It was a total rollback. But here's the thing, Tut didn't live long enough to see the full cleanup through. Around the age of 18 or 19, he died. Cause of death? Another ancient Egyptian mystery buffet. Theories include malaria, an infected leg fracture, genetic illness, or an unfortunate chariot accident. Ancient version of don't text and ride. Whatever the cause, Tut's death was sudden and left a vacuum that Egypt scrambled to fill. Ironically, for all his efforts to restore tradition and calm Egypt's religious nerves, Tutankhamun is most remembered not for what he did, but for what he left behind, a tomb, mostly intact, discovered in 1922, filled with enough gold to blind an archaeologist and enough mystery to fuel conspiracy theories for a century. He was the teenage king forced to fix his dad's weird theology and somehow made dying young the most memorable thing he did, which is kind of tragic. Tutankhamun wasn't a great conqueror, a bold builder, or a philosophical innovator. He was a kid cleaning up the world's strangest religious mess, playing monarch while his advisors steered the ship, and trying to make the gods happy again after a decade-long sun-only glitch in the system. But he was the symbol of healing, the boy king who didn't rule long but ruled at a crucial time, a bridge between chaos and order, weird and familiar, heresy and tradition, and maybe that's why we remember him, not because of who he was, but because of what Egypt became after him, whole again, balanced, and back to its regularly scheduled pantheon. In the ancient world, leaving your mark on history was a royal obsession. Pharaohs built massive temples, engraved mile-long inscriptions, and had statues so large they could double as desert traffic cones. To be forgotten was worse than death. It was cosmic irrelevance. So what do you do when a pharaoh becomes too memorable for all the wrong reasons? Simple, you cancel him. Thoroughly, repeatedly, and with a chisel. That's exactly what happened to Akhenaten. After his death, and especially after Tutankhamun and his successors rolled Egypt back to its familiar religious settings, the state launched a full-blown campaign of damnatio memoriae. That's Latin, of course, because the Romans would eventually steal the concept, but the Egyptians were already experts in the art of historical deletion. They didn't just stop worshipping Akhenaten's sun god, they tried to delete the man himself. And when Egypt doesn't like you, they don't just talk trash, they unfriend you from history itself. Let's start with the monuments. Temples built in Akhenaten's name, especially the ones dedicated to Aten, were methodically defaced. Reliefs were carved out, inscriptions hacked away, and statues smashed or buried. His distinctive elongated features? Gone. His name? Scratched out like ancient censorship graffiti. His sun god Aten was reduced to vague stone outlines that once radiated divinity, but now looked more like weathered pancake stencils. Whole walls were replastered to erase his images. Columns were chiseled down to remove cartouches bearing his name. Even his family members didn't escape. Nefertiti, his daughters, even lesser-known royal in-laws, they were either removed alongside him or had their faces and names obscured by generations determined to pretend the whole Aten saga never happened. But the real surgical strike came in the king lists. You see, ancient Egypt had a tradition of carefully recording the sequence of kings, almost like a national timeline. These lists were etched into temple walls, tombs and documents, used by priests and historians to preserve the divine continuity of rulership. And yet, Akhenaten is missing, completely. It's not that he's listed with a side note saying, oops, he's just skipped. In some versions, it's as if there was never a 17-year reign of monotheism in the middle of Egypt's new kingdom. Instead, the list might jump from Amenhotep III, his father, straight to Tutankhamun, or even Horemheb, a whole reign, erased like a typo. That's no accident. It was policy. The Egyptian state wasn't just tidying up, they were performing a spiritual exorcism, because Akhenaten hadn't just broken the rules, he had violated Ma'at, the sacred concept of balance, harmony and truth that governed everything from farming to funerals. By erasing the gods and declaring himself the mouthpiece of Aten, Akhenaten was seen as having committed a kind of theological treason, and treason in ancient Egypt had eternal consequences. So the solution was, effectively, pretend he never existed. Even the city he built, Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, was abandoned and cannibalized for parts. Blocks from Akhenaten temples were recycled into other buildings, used as foundation fill, or dumped into city walls where no one would notice them for thousands of years. It was an archaeological burial by urban planning. There's something deeply symbolic about it. Akhenaten had tried to overwrite Egypt's religious memory with his own vision. In response, Egypt didn't just reject it, they steamrolled it back into the sand. the cultural equivalent of burying your ex's mixtape in the backyard and pretending it never happened. It wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Scribes were instructed not to mention him. Temple songs stopped referencing his reign. Schools taught the official line that the traditional gods had always been in charge. And generations of Egyptians grew up never hearing Akhenaten's name unless they found an old carving that had somehow escaped the historical delete button. But of course, no memory wipe is perfect. Centuries later, fragments of his reign would begin to surface. Scattered inscriptions, broken statues, shards of aten temples recycled into other buildings. Egyptologists in the 19th and 20th centuries started to piece the story back together like a cosmic jigsaw puzzle. Confused at first by the strange art, the mysterious city, and the name that had been so thoroughly scrubbed from the record. And then came the kicker, the rediscovery of Amarna. The city Akhenaten had built for his god and his vision, abandoned, forgotten, and half swallowed by the desert, began to give up its secrets. Tombs, letters, artifacts, the heretic king came roaring back into modern history, not as a revered monarch, but as one of the most fascinating cautionary tales ancient Egypt had to offer. Ironically, the pharaoh they tried hardest to erase is now one of the most studied rulers in all of Egyptian history. Why? Because history loves a mystery, and Akhenaten is the ultimate what just happened moment, a radical, revolutionary, deeply strange man who tried to rewrite everything and ended up being footnoted into oblivion. For 3,000 years, Egypt tried to forget him. Now we can't stop remembering. After a whole story of sun gods, weird art, royal vanishing acts, and a state-sponsored game of let's pretend he never existed, we're left with one burning question. Who was Akhenaten, really? Was he the first visionary to gaze into the divine void and see a single unifying god, or just the pharaoh version of that one friend who gets way too into a new philosophy and tries to convert the group chat? Because centuries before Moses climbed Mount Sinai, Akhenaten stood in the desert and declared, "There is only one God, and it's the sun disk." A dramatic claim in a world brimming with crocodile gods, lioness goddesses, ibis-headed scribes, and hippo deities with knife collections. Ancient Egypt was practically a celestial soap opera, and Akhenaten just cancelled every character but one. That's why scholars have spent the last 200 years arguing whether this bold sun worshipper was a religious revolutionary or just an extremely eccentric megalomaniac with too much free time, and not enough advisors brave enough to say, maybe don't fire all the priests. Let's start with the monotheism question. Is Akhenaten the first monotheist in recorded history? Technically, he might be. He didn't just elevate Aten above the other gods, he abolished them. Aten wasn't the top god in a new hierarchy. Aten was the only god, no competing deities allowed. You didn't get to pray to a local crocodile anymore. You bowed to the sun, thanked it for your breakfast, and moved on. Some historians and theologians have drawn bold connections between Akhenaten and the rise of later monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. After all, the idea of one omnipotent deity who shapes the universe is a core feature of those faiths. Akhenaten was proclaiming divine unity at a time when most people had a separate god for beer, laundry, and frog infestations. But here's the thing. No direct link has ever been proven. There's no archaeological evidence showing that Akhenaten's religion directly influenced Hebrew theology. The timelines are fuzzy, the cultural bridges are missing. It's more likely that monotheism sprouted independently in different parts of the world. Still, Akhenaten earns points for originality. He may not be the father of monotheism, but he's definitely that chaotic uncle who showed up early and rearranged all the furniture. Then there's the question of motive. Was this genuine spiritual enlightenment, or a power trip disguised as religious reform? Some Egyptologists believe Akhenaten sincerely believed in Aten. The hymns to the sun god, some likely written by Akhenaten himself, are surprisingly poetic and introspective. He describes Aten as the creator of all life, the bringer of light, the hidden yet visible force behind everything. There's a passion in his language that doesn't feel fake. It feels intense. Too intense? Possibly. Others argue that the whole religious overhaul was a political strategy, a way to strip power from the priesthoods, especially the immensely wealthy cult of Ammon in Thebes. By erasing the gods, Akhenaten centralized both religious and political power in himself. After all, if there's only one god and you're the only one allowed to talk to it, congratulations, you're now the most important middleman in human history. Some scholars have even labeled him a cult leader, not in the Kool-Aid sense, but in the isolated community, obsessive belief system, total control kind of way. The move to Akhenaten, the new art style, the weird rules, the erasure of tradition, it's got all the hallmarks of a spiritual startup that scaled too fast and collapsed under its own celestial branding, and then, for 3,000 years, his legacy lay in ruins. Until the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists digging through the rubble of Amarna and the tombs of Thebes began to stumble upon the weirdest blip in Egyptian history. Letters from foreign rulers during Akhenaten's reign, fragments of strange sun disk worship, carvings of a pharaoh with a curiously stretched skull holding his wife's hand under a radiant sun. It was a forgotten world, a pharaoh erased from textbooks before textbooks existed. And when modern Egyptology finally caught up, Akhenaten didn't just return to the stage, he stole the spotlight. His reign became one of the most studied, most controversial, and most argued about chapters in all of pharaonic history. And yet, even today, we still don't know what to make of him. Was he a prophet ahead of his time, a spiritual visionary trying to break humanity out of polytheistic clutter and into divine minimalism? Or was he just a guy with sunburn, high ideals and control issues, who mistook political disruption for enlightenment? The truth, like most things in ancient Egypt, is probably buried somewhere in the middle, under a few layers of sand, shattered statues and chiseled-out names. But here's what we do know. Akhenaten's story is the plot twist no one saw coming. It's the ancient equivalent of flipping to a new season of history and finding that the writers changed the entire genre. He didn't just believe something different, he lived it, ruled by it, and tried to force an entire civilization to follow suit. And for a brief, flickering moment in the desert sun, it almost worked. Welcome to Zanzibar, circa the late 1800s, a tropical paradise off the coast of East Africa, where the beaches are white, the cloves are plentiful, and the colonial tension is thicker than British moustache wax. If you imagine a postcard-worthy island with a faint scent of cinnamon and a constant hum of imperial interference, you've got the right idea. Zanzibar at the time wasn't just a sunny getaway, it was the glittering jewel of the Swahili coast, a bustling island nation soaked in centuries of trade, culture, and more foreign visitors than a 19th century travel brochure could promise. Merchants from Persia, India, Arabia and Europe had been doing business there for centuries. By the 1800s, Zanzibar was basically the Amazon.com of the Indian Ocean, only, instead of next-day delivery, you got heavily bejeweled trade ships with exotic goods and very confused sailors trying to figure out the exchange rate. But what really made Zanzibar the crown jewel of colonial shopping lists? Spices. So many spices. We're talking cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, black pepper, basically everything you'd find in a modern hipster latte, but grown under the equatorial sun and traded for things like ivory, textiles, and occasionally extremely awkward treaties. It was even called the Spice Island, which sounds charming until you realize it made the place a magnet for every colonial power with a flag and a fleet, and that's where the British came in, floating in with their usual combo of smug intentions and naval superiority. By the mid-19th century, Zanzibar had become a British protectorate, which is colonial speak for, "This is totally your kingdom, your highness, as long as you do exactly what we say and sign here, here, and here." The British didn't invade with muskets blazing, no. They did what they did best, aggressively polite manipulation. They offered protection, read control, guidance, read interference, and a whole lot of treaties that mysteriously worked out better for Britain than anyone else. And why wouldn't they want in? Zanzibar had spice plantations, a prime trading location, and, just as a bonus, a whole bunch of internal royal drama they could conveniently stir. Which brings us to the sultans. Oh, the sultans. Zanzibar's royal line had all the elements of a prestige TV drama: ambition, betrayal, sudden deaths, and more cousins vying for the throne than a family reunion at a Game of Thrones casting call. Succession was often a delicate ballet of diplomacy, favoritism, and who could charm the British consul the fastest. Spoiler, it usually wasn't the guy with the best resume, but the one who knew which pocket held the treaty pen. The British, naturally, wanted a sultan who was manageable, not necessarily wise or just or even awake half the time, just someone they could nudge gently like a cat toward a bowl of imperialism. When a sultan died, Britain expected to have a say. Okay, the say in who got to wear the fancy hat next. But beneath all the treaties and backroom deals, there was a growing tension. The local population, while deeply involved in the trade networks and political life of the island, wasn't blind to the fact that protection came with a colonial price tag. The British influence was like that guest who comes to your dinner party, compliments your curtains, then quietly moves in and changes the locks. So here was Zanzibar in the 1890s, a politically complex island with a booming economy, a proud royal history, and a foreign power watching everything like a nosy neighbor with binoculars and a fleet of gunboats. You had ambitious royals, European meddlers, and enough cloves to season a nation. The good news? Zanzibar was thriving. The bad news? It was also simmering on a very slow boil, the kind that makes colonial officials twitch and royals sharpen their succession plans. Everyone was smiling politely, but they were also side-eyeing each other so hard the air practically buzzed. In short, Zanzibar was paradise with just enough colonial micromanagement to ruin the vibe. And just when things couldn't get more precariously balanced, a sudden royal death would knock over the entire spicy house of cards. But we'll get to that. First, let's meet the guy who saw a throne, said mine, and ended up causing history's shortest and possibly pettiest war. On the morning of August 25, 1896, Zanzibar awoke to a moment of silence, then a whole lot of chaos. Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, respected ruler, relatively obedient British ally and full-time Spice Kingdom figurehead, was dead. And not just dead, but suddenly dead. 1 minute, alive and presumably enjoying some cloves and diplomacy. The next minute, not. Now, death in royal circles is rarely just death, especially not when the nearest imperial superpower has been hovering over your shoulder like a helicopter parent at a toddler fencing class. And sure enough, the circumstances of Hamad's passing sparked more than a few raised eyebrows and whispered suspicions. Natural causes, they said. But people also said the Titanic was unsinkable, so take that with a colonial-sized grain of salt. It didn't help that, conveniently, and by conveniently we mean alarmingly fast, Hamad's cousin Khalid bin Bargahash had already made his way to the palace and declared himself the new sultan by the time Hamad's seat was still warm. Not so much as a respectful pause or mourning period. You'd think someone had told him there was a limited-time offer on thrones and he sprinted through the palace gates like it was Black Friday at Monarchy Mart. Now, Khalid wasn't just any cousin. He was that cousin, the one in every royal family tree who's just waiting for the family reunion to turn into a coup. He'd already made a failed attempt at grabbing power 3 years earlier, only to be quietly escorted out by the British and told to play nice. Apparently he didn't get the message, or more likely, he crumpled it up and used it to polish his ambitions. The moment word spread of Hamad's sudden demise and Khaled's very unsubtle power grab, British officials collectively frowned so hard you could hear it. They weren't consulted, they weren't warned, they weren't even offered a courtesy scone before the throne got hijacked. In the delicate chess game of colonial politics, Khaled just knocked over all the pieces and declared checkmate with a cannon he barely knew how to fire. And that's the heart of the issue. Britain had a guy. Oh, they definitely had a guy. His name was Hamoud bin Mohammed, and he had all the right qualities for British approval. Which is to say he was compliant, not too ambitious, and had the look of someone who'd nod a lot in meetings. The British had already quietly made up their minds about the next sultan, but Khalid apparently missed the memo and went full Game of Thrones anyway. To put it mildly, the British were not amused. They preferred their regime changes with a formal letter, a polite bow, and ideally, someone from Aten. Instead, they got Khalid, who looked at the throne like it was a coat rack at a party and said, "Finders keepers." Here's the real kicker. Khalid wasn't totally without support. He had loyalists, he had a palace full of guards, and more importantly, he had boldness, a level of boldness usually reserved for people who've just inherited a lot of debt and are pretending it's treasure. He marched into the palace and declared himself sultan as if this were the 12th century and British gunboats weren't parked just offshore, waiting for the drama to begin. And so, by the end of the day, Zanzibar found itself in a very awkward love triangle. Khalid in the palace, the British glaring from the consulate, and poor Hamoud off to the side, holding a pre-written coronation speech and wondering if anyone was going to RSVP. Diplomatic tension doesn't even begin to describe it. This was a standoff wrapped in protocol, dipped in ego, and sprinkled with just enough misunderstanding to ensure disaster. Britain was officially furious, but unofficially scrambling. They had to act fast because the last thing they wanted was for anyone on the island to think Khalid's stunt had worked. Back in London, officials prepared responses. In Zanzibar, British diplomats sent polite but firm messages. Very polite. The kind of polite that drips with implied cannon fire. One such note basically said, "We do not recognize you. Kindly vacate the throne. Warmest regards." Unsurprisingly, Khalid responded with something like, "No," and so the stage was set. One surprise death, one opportunistic cousin, one empire that didn't like being outmaneuvered by a guy who had all the subtlety of a marching band in a cathedral. To put it another way, in monarch terms, Khalid pulled the historical equivalent of calling shotgun on a moving carriage, then sitting in the seat and daring anyone to make him move. The countdown to history's shortest war had begun, all because someone died, someone else got excited, and Britain was not about to let a throne get snatched without signing off on it first. By the time the sun rose over Zanzibar on Wednesday, August 26, 1896, the island was no longer just a colonial spice hub. It was now the set of an incredibly awkward royal showdown. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash had officially locked himself inside the royal palace, and outside the British were sharpening their monocles and preparing to throw the world's shortest tantrum wrapped in naval steel. To recap, Khalid had seized the throne the moment his cousin Hamad keeled over, sprinting into the palace like a kid calling dibs on the front seat of history. The British, predictably, were not thrilled. In their view, Khalid had taken unauthorized control of an asset they very much considered part of their imperial collection. And as with all things Victorian and colonial, they had a very formal, extremely passive-aggressive process for how leadership transitions were supposed to go. Step 1. They choose the new leader. Step 2. Everyone else pretends it was their idea all along. Khalid had skipped both steps and added his own. Lock the doors, build a militia, and look menacing. And that's exactly what he did. Khalid barricaded himself inside the palace with an energy that screamed, "No one's taking this throne unless they drag me out by my mustache." He rallied his loyalists, about 2,800 of them, made up of palace guards, askaris, local soldiers, and several hundred men with strong opinions and very questionable aim. He also had artillery, sort of. His defences included a handful of cannons, at least one Gatling gun, and a battery or two that hadn't been tested since approximately the Crimean War. Let's just say his military hardware had vibes but not much else. Still, it looked impressive enough to locals, and from inside the palace gates it might have even felt like a strong position. But appearances can be deceiving, especially when your opponent is Britain and they show up with actual warships. Yes, the British answered Khalid's palace lock-in with the equivalent of kicking down the front door using a fleet. Within hours, 3 Royal Navy ships were anchored in the harbour: HMS St. George, HMS Philomore, and HMS Raccoon, because nothing says subtle diplomacy like naming a gunboat after an aggressive woodland creature. And they didn't come alone. Marines disembarked, guns were calibrated. Naval officers checked their pocket watches, presumably to time exactly how long this would take. Spoiler, not very. Back at the British consulate, diplomatic messages flew like hot scones at a scandalous tea party. Consul Basil Cave. Yes, his real name. And yes, it sounds like he should have been solving murders in a Victorian detective novel. Was doing his best to resolve the situation without a war. He sent Khalid messages, then warnings, then ultimatums. All very formal, of course. His first note read something like, "We do not recognize your claim to the throne. Please vacate the palace." In British diplomatic terms, that's the equivalent of saying we're trying very hard not to flatten your house right now. Khalid naturally replied with the timeless royal response, "Make me." This was not the kind of answer the empire appreciated. Still, Khalid doubled down. He had his supporters painting the palace walls with courage, stocking supplies and manning defenses that looked sturdy if you didn't look too closely. In fact, one of the palace's prized pieces of artillery was said to be a cannon gifted by Germany, a symbol of friendship that may or may not have been functional. Think of it like receiving a blender as a wedding gift that turns out to be a lamp. Decorative? Yes. Helpful in a war? Not quite. Meanwhile, British ships began taking measurements, literally. Officers surveyed the harbour, lined up coordinates and began plotting where their shells would land. Their aim wasn't just to win, it was to make a point. The kind of point that's loud, smoky and measured in craters. And this is where the dynamic got hilariously one-sided. Khalid was playing Risk, the British were playing Battleship, and they had all the cheat codes. He had troops with mixed training, borrowed artillery, and palace walls that hadn't seen real battle since pirates were a thing. The British, on the other hand, had gunboats with 6-inch cannons, precision engineering and decades of practice in accidentally conquering places. And most importantly, they were very used to winning. But in Khalid's mind, the gamble still made sense. Maybe he thought Britain wouldn't actually fire. Maybe he believed Germany would swoop in and back him up. Maybe he just had a really stubborn streak and a throne that was very comfortable. Whatever the logic, one thing was clear. Khalid had drawn a line in the sand, and the British had just drawn naval crosshairs on his palace roof. The city watched, holding its breath. Merchants paused mid-sail. Couriers darted through alleyways with messages that grew more panicked by the hour. Everyone knew that something was about to happen, but no one, not even Khalid, could have guessed just how brief it would be. But before we get to the moment the fuse was lit, there's one more chapter to unfold. Because when the world's most polite empire gives you a deadline, you'd better believe they've got a stopwatch ready. At exactly 8 a.m. on Thursday, August 27, 1896, Zanzibar time, a final ultimatum was delivered to Sultan Khalid bin Bargash. The note, firm, concise, and brimming with that uniquely British ability to sound polite while planning destruction, read, more or less, "Vacate the palace by 9 a.m., or we will consider ourselves at war with you. We hope this will not be necessary. Also, please don't make us ruin your antique furniture." Khalid received the message, glanced at the ticking clock, and responded in the boldest way he could under the circumstances. He did absolutely nothing, and so began one of the shortest countdowns to armed conflict in recorded history. Just 60 minutes between a written threat and a very loud historical footnote. Outside the palace, the situation was about as tense as colonial tension could get without someone shouting "fire" prematurely. British forces had carefully positioned themselves throughout the harbour. 3 warships, HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, and HMS Raccoon, sat ominously in the turquoise water like floating thunderclouds. On land, 150 or so Royal Marines stood at the ready, bayonets fixed, expressions stoic, and very possibly annoyed they were up this early. For the British, this was less of a war and more of a punctual military demonstration. But back inside the palace, Khalid remained defiant, or depending on who you ask, very committed to denial. He had roughly 2,800 supporters, a scattering of rusting artillery, and the world's most misplaced optimism. He assumed the British were bluffing. After all, No one starts a war before brunch, right? Wrong. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the final seconds of diplomacy ticked away. If this were a movie, this would be the moment the dramatic music swells and someone whispers, "It's too quiet." At 9:02 and 30 seconds, the first British shell screamed through the air and slammed into the Sultan's palace with the kind of emphasis usually reserved for wedding vows and really dramatic resignations. Wood shattered, glass flew, decorative arches from centuries past crumbled like overbaked scones. The war had begun, and honestly, it escalated very quickly. British gunners had, shall we say, not held back. They were under orders to disable Khalid's artillery, level his defences, and ideally persuade him to rethink his morning plans. They achieved all three objectives in record time. Shell after shell rained down on the palace, the harbour defences, and Khalid's ceremonial yacht, the HHS Glasgow, which was anchored nearby and for reasons still unclear, decided it might fire back once or twice. That lasted all of 5 minutes before British naval guns politely reminded it that yachts are for leisure, not combat. By 9:05 a.m., much of the palace was on fire. By 9:15, several hundred of Khalid's troops had either fled or been injured, and by 9:40 a.m., it was all over. 38 minutes. That was it. The entirety of the Anglo-Zanzibar War. It takes longer to sit through a dentist's waiting room. It takes longer to boil potatoes. It took longer to make a cup of tea than it did to flatten a palace. Here's what those 38 minutes accomplished. The palace was reduced to smouldering ruins. Khalid's so-called army had either vanished or surrendered. British casualties: one sailor, who was injured, not killed, when he fell off a ladder. That's it. Zanzibari casualties: somewhere between 500 and 600 depending on the source, making it a tragically one-sided affair. And what of Khalid, the man who had started this whole royal ruckus? He disappeared. No, really. As the shells fell and the windows exploded, he vanished from the palace like a magician with a deadline. By the time the smoke cleared, he had slipped out the back and run to the nearby German consulate, where he knocked on the door out of breath and said something along the lines of, "Hi, I just started a war and would very much like asylum now, please." The Germans, who were very much not looking to get dragged into this imperial mess, took him in, leading to an entirely different diplomatic headache that we'll get to later. But for now, the British stood victorious and slightly confused about what to do next. After all, they had technically fought and won a war, but hadn't had time to break a sweat. Official telegrams flew. The world press blinked in confusion. Some newspapers published headlines that afternoon along the lines of, "Zanzibar war ends, lasted less than an episode of anything." Others didn't even report it until the next day, unsure if it had really happened or was just a colonial miscommunication with explosives. In military history, wars are often measured in years, or at least months. This one, measured in minutes, 38 of them to be exact. An entire war conducted, concluded, and cleaned up before anyone even needed a second cup of coffee. And while it was a minor blip on the global stage, the Anglo-Zanzibar War has gone down as a record setter. It wasn't a glorious victory. It wasn't a drawn-out campaign. It was a warning shot with paperwork, a palace eviction with cannonballs, a very emphatic no, and now, with the dust still settling, and Khalid now someone else's diplomatic problem, Britain had to decide what to do next. But don't worry, we're only halfway through this tale. Just because the war ended doesn't mean the mess did. Now that we've established that the Anglo-Zanzibar War was less epic military campaign and more highly destructive coffee break, it's time to zoom in on those infamous 38 minutes. Because while short, this war was nothing if not efficient. So let's break it down, minute by minute, blast by blast, and eyebrow raise by eyebrow raise. 9:02 a.m. Deadline missed. Politeness evaporates. The British ultimatum had expired exactly 2 minutes earlier. They waited just long enough to confirm that Khalid had not, in fact, had a sudden change of heart, conscience, or geography. And with that, diplomacy was officially yeeted out the window, and the warships got the green light to let loose. 9:02:30 a.m. The palace has a bad day. The first shell from HMS St. George soared through the morning air and slammed directly into the Sultan's palace. No warning shots, no dramatic speeches, no climactic trumpet solo. Just boom. The impact shattered windows, knocked masonry flying, and gave the entire Zanzibari coast the historical equivalent of a wake-up slap. And once that first shot landed, the rest came in rapid succession. British gunners operated with the precision of a music box and the enthusiasm of people who hadn't gotten to blow something up in at least a few weeks. The palace, a lovely coral stone structure built to impress dignitaries and house sultans, notwithstand naval bombardments, began to crumble like a soggy biscuit in hot tea. 9:05 a.m. Artillery, more like artillery-ish. Khalid's men scrambled to return fire. A few of their ancient cannons fired back, mostly out of instinct and desperation. Some fired into the harbour, some missed entirely, and one might have exploded on its own without any prompting. At least one gun crew fired bravely and then ran before they could reload. Whether this was a tactical retreat or a panicked sprint towards safety is still up for debate. And then there was Khalid's yacht, the gloriously named HHS Glasgow, which valiantly decided to join the fight. Well, for about 5 minutes, armed with a handful of light weapons, the yacht fired at the British ships and likely annoyed a seagull. In return, the Royal Navy sank it, hard, probably just to make a point, and honestly, it wasn't even a strategic target. It was just there, floating in view, like a reminder that Khalid had dreams of being both sultan and seafarer. The British responded with the historical equivalent of, "Nice boat, be a shame if anything happened to it," so they sank it. For extra pettiness, 9:30 a.m., casualties and chaos. Inside the burning, shell-shattered palace, Khalid's forces were in full retreat mode. Smoke poured through the windows, walls collapsed inward, and what remained of his army quickly realized this was not going to be the glorious stand they'd hoped for. The air was filled with dust, fire, and what must have been a growing sense of regret. In terms of casualties, the numbers were devastatingly one-sided. Approximately 500 Zanzibari soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded during the bombardment. These were men who had barely been trained, many armed with outdated rifles and fighting under a leader who had confidently walked into a military disaster with nothing but bravado and a crumbling fortress. Meanwhile, on the British side, reports list exactly one injury, a sailor who fell while climbing a ladder. That's right, not shot, not stabbed, not even mildly bruised by a cannonball, just gravity. You could almost hear the British admiral scribbling in his report. Total casualties, one sailor, ankle, sustained during enthusiastic ladder behavior. 9:35 a.m., Khalid, exit stage Germany. With the palace in ruins and his makeshift army in retreat, Khalid did what many people would do in such a situation. He fled, not valiantly, not with flair, just quietly. Sneaking out a side door with a handful of guards, he made a beeline to the German consulate, less than 300 meters away. Now, the German consulate was neutral territory, which meant it was legally off-limits for British attack. Khalid arrived sweaty, soot-streaked, and extremely done with being sultan. He banged on the door like a man trying to return a throne that no longer fit. The Germans, understandably, opened the door with the enthusiasm of someone hearing, "Hey, I just started a war and need to crash on your couch," but to their credit, they took him in. And just like that, the man who declared himself Sultan of Zanzibar had gone from royal palace to diplomatic panic room in less than an hour. When your enemy flees to Germany for help, you know things have truly spiraled. 9:40 a.m. It's over. The bombardment stopped. British troops stood down. Zanzibar was silent again, except for the crackle of fire and the sound of British officers checking their watches and muttering, "Well, that was efficient." With the palace in ruins and Khalid nowhere to be found except behind thick German walls, the British had won, completely, quickly, spectacularly, and so ended the 38-minute war. A royal tantrum met with gunboat therapy, a throne claimed and unclaimed before anyone could brew a proper pot of tea. But the aftermath, Now that was going to get diplomatic. So what exactly happens after you lose a war in less time than it takes to sit through a bad first date? Well, if you're Khalid bin Bargash, apparently not much. After the palace lay in ruins, the yacht sat in the harbour as a sunken metaphor, and the smoke had politely cleared from Zanzibar's skyline. The British got to do their favourite thing, reorganise everything without asking. And by reorganise we mean dust off their preferred royal candidate, straighten his ceremonial sash, and walk him into a throne room that now had slightly more ventilation than usual. Enter Hamoud bin Mohammed, a man who, if royal pliability were an Olympic sport, would have taken home gold for synchronized nodding. Hamoud had been the British favourite from the start, mostly because he had a remarkable ability to smile, agree, and not try to spontaneously seize power. As sultans go, he wasn't exactly inspiring, but he was safe, which to Britain was code for won't start a diplomatic incident before tea time. The coronation happened with minimal fanfare, no cannon blasts this time, no parades, no royal proclamations booming across the city, just a simple ceremony, a few colonial grins, and a tacit understanding that Hamoud would be the Sultan of Zanzibar in name only. In truth, the real throne now sat inside the British consulate, behind a desk, with tea stains on the paperwork. Hamoud was effectively a royal sock puppet, and everyone knew it. He issued decrees, but only the ones already approved. He attended events, but only the ones the British organised. His job was to wear the crown, smile for the public, and never ever act like a man who could start a 38-minute war. Meanwhile, across the water, Khalid was living what can only be described as the most undeservedly chill exile in history. After fleeing to the German consulate, he was smuggled out of Zanzibar entirely. Germany, having absolutely no interest in a diplomatic shouting match with Britain, agreed to house Khalid in German East Africa, present-day Tanzania, and thus the man who caused colonial mayhem with a single locked palace door ended up living peacefully under German protection for decades. Let's be clear, Khalid faced zero consequences, no trial, no punishment, not even a stern talking to, and a confiscated scepter. He simply relocated, unpacked his ego, and lived out the rest of his days in relative comfort, probably telling every visitor, "I was Sultan once," and conveniently leaving out the part where his reign lasted roughly the same amount of time as a particularly long shower. He would eventually die in 1927 in Mombasa, Kenya, never returning to Zanzibar, never punished, and likely never fully understanding how close he came to being a historical footnote written in smoke. Meanwhile, back on the island, the British used the aftermath of the war as a blank slate. Zanzibar became even more of a colonial outpost than ever before, with their puppet sultan in place, and their naval muscle clearly unmatched. They tightened their grip on every aspect of the region: trade, taxation, foreign policy, and the all-important scheduling of ceremonial banquets. British advisors were now embedded in every ministry. British officers oversaw the island's defences, because apparently one war was enough to prove local leadership wasn't exactly fortress material. Even the Sultan's budget had to be approved by British officials. Picture a royal who can't even buy his own curtains without colonial approval. That was Zanzibar now. The whole incident also sent a message across the region. It told other territories, other sultans, and other hopeful crown grabbers, don't try it. Britain had not only crushed a rebellion, they'd done it in under an hour. A very loud, very calculated hour that echoed across East Africa. And all it took was some heavy artillery, 3 warships, and the world's least subtle ultimatum. What's almost laughable is how little this war changed global history. There were no treaties redrawing borders, no reparations, no new powers rising or empires falling. It was a flare-up, a minor colonial footnote with maximum overkill. But it left Zanzibar changed forever. The local monarchy would never again hold real power. The illusion of independence had been shattered with the palace windows. And the man who caused it all? He got to enjoy early retirement in coastal German territory, presumably in a chair that didn't have scorch marks. He lost a war in less time than it takes to microwave a baked potato, and somehow still got early retirement. That, dear listener, is colonial chaos at its finest. So you might be wondering, was this whole thing really about a royal succession? Did the British honestly flatten a palace, sink a yacht, and declare a 38-minute war just because their preferred prince didn't get the throne? Well, yes, and also absolutely not. On the surface, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was triggered by a single act, Khalid bin Bargash claiming the throne without Britain's approval. That alone, in the tangled world of colonial etiquette, was considered a slap in the face with a velvet glove. But beneath that singular spark lay a much bigger bonfire made of ego, empire, and centuries of overcompensating foreign policy. Let's start with Britain. By the late 1800s, the British Empire was at its swaggering peak, strutting across the world map like a monocled peacock in polished boots. This was the era of the sun never sets on the British Empire, which was less about geography and more about their refusal to take a vacation from colonizing things. From Canada to India to Australia to vast swaths of Africa, Britain wasn't just running empires, it was collecting them, like an imperial Pokemon master. Now, Zanzibar may have been a tiny island compared to India or Egypt, but it sat at a crucial crossroads of trade, politics, and influence on the East African coast. It had a deep-water port, access to the Indian Ocean, and enough cloves to make Queen Victoria's bathwater smell like a Victorian bakery. In other words, strategic. And if there's one thing Britain didn't like, it was losing control over strategic locations. So when Khalid marched into the palace like he was claiming a seat at the dinner table, Britain didn't just see an ambitious royal, they saw a dangerous precedent. If Zanzibar could change sultans without asking London for permission, what was next? Independent decision-making, a flag redesign, a suggestion that maybe Britain shouldn't own the weather. They couldn't let it stand. Zanzibar, for its part, wasn't exactly trying to ignite global conflict. The island had long tried to walk a tightrope between appeasing foreign powers and maintaining its own traditions. For generations, sultans had played the diplomatic game, signing treaties with one hand while quietly maintaining local rule with the other. But by the 1890s, that game was wearing thin. Autonomy was slipping. British advisors were meddling in everything from customs duties to cabinet appointments. Locals could see the writing on the palace walls. The crown still existed, but the real power came with a British signature at the bottom of every decision. When Khalid claimed the throne, it wasn't just a grab for royal power. It was a desperate bid to remind the world that Zanzibar still had its own pulse. In truth, this wasn't really about royal succession, it was about power projection. Britain wanted to make an example. Zanzibar wanted to reassert identity. The result? A glorified bar fight with boats. But what made it truly absurd was the way colonial politics operated like high-stakes theatre performed by actors who'd all forgotten the script. Britain's claim to moral authority in Zanzibar was based on protection, but that protection looked a lot like ownership. Zanzibar's royal line still wore crowns, but those crowns came with invisible strings attached. Everyone was playing along with a system that pretended to be mutual, but was really just an elaborate game of yes, your majesty, but only if London says so. And then Khalid broke the script. He didn't wait for permission, he didn't ask for approval, he just declared himself sultan. Cue the outrage. Not because it was illegal, Zanzibar had technically elected its own rulers for generations, but because it violated the sacred rule of colonial choreography. Always let the empire lead the dance. The British response was instant and theatrical. They could have negotiated, they could have blocked trade, frozen assets, or imposed sanctions, but none of those things make nearly as satisfying a sound as cannon fire. So instead, they launched a naval show of force so wildly disproportionate it felt like using a howitzer to squash a gnat. Because nothing says diplomacy like lobbing artillery at your former business partner's front porch. What really makes this all ridiculous in hindsight is the sheer speed of it. One day, Zanzibar had a living sultan. The next, the palace was rubble and the throne had been swapped out like bad upholstery. No backroom diplomacy, No extended negotiations, just boom, problem solved. With gunpowder and punctuality. In reality, Britain didn't need to invade Zanzibar, but it wanted to send a message, not just to Zanzibar, but to anyone else in its imperial orbit who might be thinking of improvising their future. The message was, try something cute and your palace gets a canon makeover. And it worked. Sort of. Nobody else tried anything similar in the region. But they also didn't forget, because the war might have lasted only 38 minutes, but the lesson lasted much longer. When empires feel disrespected, they don't debate, they detonate. So was the Anglo-Zanzibar War about succession? Yes, on paper, but in reality, it was a microcosm of colonial control, where empires flexed their muscles, islands fought to keep their dignity, and cannonballs delivered policy updates faster than any diplomat ever could. If you were to walk up to someone on the street and say, "Did you know there was a war that only lasted 38 minutes?" You'd likely get a look somewhere between polite confusion and "should I call someone?" And honestly, who could blame them? Wars, historically speaking, are sprawling things, drawn out, agonizing affairs that eat years, swallow nations, and leave behind memorials, textbooks, and bitter grandpas. But this war, this one wrapped up in time for brunch, the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 is, according to virtually every credible historian with access to a stopwatch, the shortest recorded war in human history. A military conflict so brief it's less epic saga and more slightly aggressive event, when you consider that other wars have lasted decades, some even centuries. This one barely registered a blip. You could have overslept and missed the whole thing. Literally. Of course, other short wars have tried to compete. The football war of 1969 between Honduras and El Salvador, sparked, believe it or not, by a World Cup qualifying match, lasted 4 days. Impressive, but still nowhere near Zanzibar levels of brevity. There's also the Six-Day War of 1967 between Israel and its neighbors, which is often mistaken for the shortest due to its name. But again, 6 days is practically an eternity, when you realize Zanzibar's war didn't even last long enough to count as a full TV episode. And yet, despite holding the Guinness-certified gold-plated world record for most efficient declaration and conclusion of hostilities, pop culture doesn't really care. You won't see it in blockbuster war movies. There are no slow-motion scenes of dramatic sacrifices, no soaring orchestral scores, no gritty speeches shouted over the roar of battle. Why? Because by the time anyone had a chance to emotionally invest in the story, the credits were already rolling. It's hard to get Hollywood excited about a war where the biggest dramatic tension is, will he leave the palace by 9 or not? The result is that this historic anomaly often feels like a joke pulled out at dinner parties or pub trivia nights. It's a historical oddity, a novelty, a one-hit wonder of warfare. It sounds fake, even though it's not. There are real war logs, real casualty reports, and real pieces of a blown-up palace still buried under the streets of modern Zanzibar. But for many, it still feels like someone made it up to win a bar bet. And yet the legacy it leaves behind is surprisingly important. First, there's the way it perfectly encapsulates the absurdity of late-stage empire. You have an empire so vast and bureaucratic that it responds to a disputed succession with immediate firepower. No debates, no delay, just cannonballs and paperwork. It reflects a time when European powers ruled huge swaths of the globe, not through diplomacy or partnership, but through carefully timed shows of overwhelming force. Zanzibar wasn't just being taught a lesson, it was being turned into a cautionary tale for every other territory under Britain's oversized thumb. Second, the war became a kind of symbolic shorthand for colonial arrogance. It's the historical equivalent of swatting a fly with a bazooka. Even today, historians reference it when discussing how empires handled minor challenges, i.e., with way more firepower than necessary and an alarming lack of self-awareness. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is simply this: people still talk about it. Sure, not in the same breath as the World Wars or the Napoleonic campaigns, but in classrooms, textbooks, documentaries, and the odd dusty corner of YouTube. The Anglo-Zanzibar War still pops up, its entire existence almost comically brief but undeniably real. It reminds us that history isn't just about size or scale. Sometimes it's about the weirdness. And what could be weirder than a war where the first shot was fired 2 minutes after the deadline? The last shot was fired before anyone had time to reload their outrage. The losing side's leader escaped to a nearby building and stayed there like a teenager sulking in their room. And the entire conflict wrapped up so fast, the British casualty report read like a minor workplace accident. They say history is written by the victors, but in this case, it was more like scribbled down during a tea break. The British barely had time to polish their boots before the battle was over. One imagines some poor clerk back in London receiving a telegram that read, "War occurred, we won, had toast after." Ultimately, the Anglo-Zanzibar War lives on, not because of its impact, but because of its improbability. It's the kind of event that historians love precisely because it makes no sense. It defies every expectation of what a war should be. Drawn out, costly, messy. This one was brief, ridiculous, and almost too neatly wrapped. And in a world full of long, painful, devastating conflicts, maybe it's okay to remember the one war that ended before anyone even got a good war story out of it. Imagine waking up in the morning with no alarm clock, no phone, no digital screen screaming 7:32 a.m., and most terrifying of all, no idea whether you've overslept or invented a new form of medieval punctuality. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where time existed, sure, just not in any way we'd recognize today. Timekeeping in the medieval world was less about precision and more about impression. There were no hours etched in stone, no minutes ticking away in nervous anticipation. Instead, medieval people gauged time the way you might guess how long you've been waiting for a pizza. Vaguely, hungrily, and usually wrong. Because let's be honest, if you asked a 13th century farmer what time it was, he'd probably squint at the sun, scratch his beard and say something like, about 2 sheep lengths before dinner. You see, back then, time wasn't a universal constant, it was a local rumor, and every village, monastery and grumpy knight had their own version of it. For starters, people in the medieval era didn't need time in the way we do. Their lives weren't broken into scheduled blocks or Zoom calls. Time was marked by what was happening, not what was on the clock. Morning began when the rooster got chatty. Afternoon arrived when the sun was directly above your sweating forehead. And bedtime? Well, that came when you couldn't see your own feet and wolves started sounding a little too close for comfort. There was no such thing as being 5 minutes late, mostly because there was no such thing as 5 minutes. To the average peasant, timekeeping was something rich people worried about, like taxes, heresy trials, or whether the king was coming over for soup. And even among the elite, there wasn't exactly a synchronized schedule. One nobleman might think it was mid-morning. His neighbor across the hill? Definitely late afternoon. Who was right? Honestly, no one. That's the charm. Of course, some people did try to keep track of time. These were usually monks, astronomers, or anyone whose job description included knows what a bell is for. But even then, knowing the time was more of an interpretive dance than a science. You looked at the sun, listened to the bells, maybe licked a finger and held it to the wind. Time was a feeling, a hunch, a cosmic shrug. And let's not forget how the seasons messed everything up. Summer days were long, and winter days were, well, medieval. When daylight hours varied wildly across the year, so did people's sense of time. Some days had 14 hours of daylight, others barely had 8. So if someone told you they worked an 8-hour day, what they really meant was, I've been chasing this cow since dawn and the cow is still winning. But here's where it gets even better. Even the concept of an hour wasn't fixed. Medieval hours were divided by daylight, meaning the length of an hour changed depending on the season. Yes, you heard that right. In the summer, hours were longer because the day was longer. In winter, shorter. So not only did you not know what time it was, you didn't even know how long time was. It's like trying to bake cookies in an oven where the minutes are made of spaghetti. People essentially lived on event-based time. You didn't meet someone at 3 p.m. When you met them after the bell tolls for none, or before the goats wander off again. It was a lifestyle fueled by sunlight, church bells, and sheer optimistic guesswork. And this wasn't just for farmers or small townsfolk. Even kings and queens ran their lives by these vague rhythms. Royal meetings began after Mass or at the third hour, which, depending on the scribe, could mean anything between mid-morning and the start of nap time. This explains a lot about medieval diplomacy. But here's the twist. Despite all this ambiguity, people still functioned, crops were planted, trades were conducted, armies managed to show up to battles, mostly on the same day. The world turned, the sun rose and fell, and nobody ever once asked, "Is this meeting being recorded?" In short, time wasn't measured with gears or numbers, it was lived. Time was local, flexible, and thoroughly disobedient to anything resembling consistency. So yes, it was a world without watches. But it was also a world where people weren't ruled by ticking anxiety or digital reminders to drink water. Time, in the medieval world, wasn't a tyrant. It was just another part of the landscape, like fog, or that one cow that always ended up in someone else's cabbage patch. In today's world, noon is a comforting certainty. At exactly 12 p.m., your phone buzzes, your stomach growls, and the sandwich shop down the street fires up the panini press like a holy ritual. It's consistent, precise, mathematically pleasing, but if you tried pulling that routine in medieval Europe, someone might tilt their head, squint at the sky, and ask, 12? 12 what? Because in the medieval world, noon didn't mean 12 o'clock. It didn't even mean one specific time. Noon, my friend, was more of a suggestion. Let's get this out of the way. The word noon originally came from the Latin word nona hora, meaning the 9th hour of the day. But wait, 9th? As in 3 p.m? Yep, that's where it started. But monks being monks, someone along the way looked at the sun, the bells, their increasingly hungry stomach, and decided, 3? Nah, let's bump it earlier. Eventually, nona hora drifted backward through time like a confused tourist and settled sometime around midday. But even midday was a moving target. Here's the thing. Medieval time didn't run on a fixed length hour like it does now. Instead, the day was split into 12 daylight hours and 12 nighttime hours, no matter how long or short the day actually was. Which means in summer, when daylight stretched on like a lazy picnic, each hour was much longer. And in winter, your hour might be barely enough time to stew a turnip. Hours were elastic. So when people said noon, they didn't mean 12 60-minute ticks after midnight. They meant the halfway point between sunrise and sunset. If sunrise was at 5 a.m. and sunset at 9 p.m., noon would hit at 2 p.m. But in winter, when daylight only lasted from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., noon might hit closer to 12 p.m., or even earlier, depending on your latitude and how ambitious your rooster felt that morning. It was a system that made sense in a world tied to the sun and seasons, but for us modern creatures, used to the relentless precision of quartz watches and satellite-synced smartphones, it's like discovering that time used to be held together with hope and guesswork. And if that wasn't confusing enough, different places had different noons. Since every village, town, or monastery based their hours on the sun's local position, noon in one town could be several minutes or even an hour off from the town next door. Time was fiercely local. You didn't adjust your schedule based on a national standard. You adjusted it based on where the sun hit your face and whether Brother Martin had already rung the third bell. There was no Greenwich Mean Time, no global time zones, no daylight savings, just vibes, and the occasional shouting bell tower. Imagine trying to plan a meeting in this system. Let's meet at noon, you say. Great, they reply. Except their noon is your early afternoon. Your early afternoon is their mid-morning, and by the time you both arrive, the goats have eaten the paperwork and someone's already declared it's supper time. It's also why travelers had to be human time converters. If you were journeying across multiple towns, you'd mentally adjust your idea of noon at each stop. It's like changing your watch for every village. You didn't just bring money and bread. you brought a flexible relationship with chronology. This subjective system also led to some glorious ambiguity. Laws might be enforced after midday, or events scheduled before sunset, but there was rarely a ticking countdown to get things done. It was more about relative positioning in the day than any precise numerical anchor. You did things when it made sense, not when a clock told you to. And naturally, this had consequences, especially when cities began to grow and people needed more reliable coordination for trade, markets, and religious observance. Eventually, towns tried to synchronize their bells and tower clocks, but without standard timekeeping tools, it was like asking cats to march in formation. And yes, sometimes people cheated. A bell ringer might ring noon early to sell more bread before another market opened. A crafty noble might schedule a duel at noon, then show up late on purpose to throw off their opponent. Time was bendable and occasionally weaponized. But despite all this, medieval people weren't confused. They understood their system, they just didn't expect time to be a rigid cage. Time moved like everything else in their world, with nature, not against it. So yes, noon could be at 11:40, or 12:15, or 1:10, or whenever the shadow on the sundial stopped doing that weird thing. It didn't really matter, because time wasn't about syncing your watch, it was about syncing with the world. In other words, noon wasn't 12, it was more of a vibe. If you were living in a medieval village and heard a bell ringing in the distance, you had a few possible reactions. 1. Drop to your knees and pray. 2. Run because something's on fire. Or 3. Sigh because it meant the monks were doing that thing again. Yes, in a world where clocks were rare, hours were stretchy, and the sun was everyone's best guess, the monasteries were the ones trying to keep time on a leash, and doing it with bells, discipline, and divine anxiety. Welcome to the monastic schedule, also known as the Liturgy of the Hours, or as I like to call it, the sacred art of not sleeping in. Monks didn't just keep time, they lived by it. Their days were carved into specific chunks of prayer, reflection, chanting, and very, very early wake-ups. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they were the human version of Google Calendar, except with more incense and worse lighting. The average day in a monastery was divided into 8 canonical hours, each one marked by prayer, scripture, and often a desperate desire for coffee that wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. Let's walk through it, shall we? Matins, the middle of the night one, roughly 2 or 3 a.m. Yes, this is when the monks got up to start their day. You haven't truly lived until you've chanted psalms while everyone else is asleep and the only light source is a candle doing its best impression of a nervous moth. Lauds, dawn prayers. As the sun rises, the bells ring again. It's too early for reason but just late enough for divine obligation. You're not fully awake, but God is watching, so you go. Prime, the first official hour of daytime, often around 6 a.m. This is where the day really kicks off, complete with readings, hymns, and possibly regret. Terce and none. These are the mid-morning, noonish, and mid-afternoon checkpoints. Their names sound like either obscure Latin Pokemon or a lawyer firm no one wants to hire. But these hours were the backbone of monastic routine. You stopped what you were doing, copying manuscripts, gardening, or trying not to fall asleep standing up and went to pray. Vespers, early evening prayers, usually around sunset. Think of this as the monks' equivalent of winding down with Netflix, but replace TV drama with solemn chanting in unison. Compline, night prayers, the spiritual version of tucking the universe into bed. After this, the monks could finally rest for about 4 hours before matins rudely burst back in. This rhythm, relentless, sacred and bell-powered, was more than just spiritual devotion. It was timekeeping in a world without clocks. Monks, by adhering to such a rigid structure, became unofficial chronometers for everyone else. If you lived near a monastery, the sound of the bell tower was your schedule. You didn't check your phone, you waited for the ding, and it wasn't a soft, melodic ding either. Monastic bells were loud, metallic, and unapologetically disruptive. They rang out across the countryside, cutting through fog, rain, and awkward conversations like divine thunder. For the monks, this was an invitation to prayer. For the rest of the town, it was often just a reminder that someone, somewhere, was more organized than they were. Now imagine the job of the monk assigned to keep track of all this, known as the sacristan, or sometimes the timekeeper monk. This poor soul had to wake up before everyone else, light the lamps, count the hours since the last prayer, and then ring the bell at just the right time, without clocks, without iPhones, just the stars, the sky, and possibly a water clock if their monastery had a generous patron. Accuracy was debatable. If the clouds were thick or the sun hadn't shown up to work, you might get vespers at lunchtime or compline before the goats were back in the barn. But the effort was there. The commitment was real. Monks weren't just keeping track of time. They were imposing order on a chaotic cosmic schedule. They were saying, yes, the sun rises at different times every day, but our bells rise when we say so. And this dedication to structure had ripple effects. Travelers, merchants, even town councils would sometimes base their meetings or opening hours around monastic time. If the monks rang sext, it was close enough to lunchtime for the baker to roll out the bread. The monastery became a kind of gravitational center, not just spiritually but temporally. The irony, of course, is that monks weren't trying to run the world's clocks. They weren't inventing time zones or organizing train schedules. They were just trying to live closer to God, but in doing so, they accidentally became the default timekeepers for medieval society. So, if you heard a bell in medieval Europe, it meant one of two things. Either it was time to pray, or something was horribly, catastrophically wrong, like a fire, an attack, or Brother Augustine falling into the wine vat again. In short, if you heard a bell, it meant it was either time to pray or time to panic. Picture this. You're in medieval Europe. You've got a field to plough, a goat to chase, and a meeting with the local tax collector who may or may not be able to read. You need to know what time it is, but there's no clock on your wall, no phone in your pocket, and no helpful voice assistant to tell you you're already late. What do? Simple. You turn to the most technologically advanced instruments available to the medieval mind. Sticks, sand, water, wax, and a whole lot of optimism. Welcome to the world of medieval timekeeping tools. A charming collection of guessometers that were less about precision and more about vibes. These devices didn't measure time so much as suggest that it was probably happening. Let's start with the crowd favorite, the sundial. It's the oldest clock on the list and in theory the most elegant. A stick, known as a gnomon, casts a shadow onto a marked surface, and as the sun moves across the sky, the shadow shifts to indicate the hour. Simple, graceful, and completely useless on cloudy days, which, this being Europe, was about 80% of the time. The medieval sundial was reliable until the sun remembered it had clouds to hide behind. Want to know what time it is on a foggy morning in November? Too bad. Your stick says try again later. Also, sundials weren't exactly portable. You couldn't stick one on your wrist or toss it in your satchel, unless you had a travel-sized version, which some wealthy folks did. But even then, they only worked if you knew your latitude, held them at just the right angle, and again could see the actual sun. So basically, perfect for someone with a degree in astronomy and nothing else to do. Enter the water clock, or clepsydra, for those of us who enjoy words that sound like magical diseases. This was the idea of measuring time by tracking the flow of water from one container to another. You'd fill a pot, poke a hole in it, and watch as the water slowly dribbled out, marking the passage of time with carefully etched lines or floating pegs. Ingenious? Yes. Accurate? Not remotely. Water flow changed depending on temperature, humidity, the size of the hole, and whether your cousin accidentally kicked the table. Also, it required someone to sit there watching a bucket drip, which, even in the medieval world, was considered a bit of a snooze. Then there were candle clocks. These were tall candles with markings down the side. As the candle burned, the wax melted past each mark, indicating another unit of time had passed. Handy at night, but prone to failure in, say, breezes, rodents, accidental tipping, or overzealous monks who thought it was just a really nice candle. And let's not forget that candles don't burn consistently. the wax type, wick thickness, and even the room temperature all conspired to ensure that your 2-hour candle might fizzle out in 47 minutes or decide it's going to last until tomorrow. Still, they had their uses. Some clever monks even embedded metal balls into the wax so they'd drop onto a plate with a ding when a specific time had passed. It was a bit like setting an alarm, except the alarm might not go off, or might go off while you were asleep and then immediately set the curtain on fire. Next up, the hourglass, that eternally Instagrammable icon of time. These functioned by letting sand fall through a narrow neck from one bulb to another. Once the sand ran out, you'd flip it over and do it all again. These were surprisingly accurate if built well and not jostled. But as with everything else in this chapter, the medieval version came with caveats. Sand quality mattered. Who knew there was such a thing as clock-grade sand? The bulbs had to be symmetrical, and God help you if you tilted the thing while walking. Still, hourglasses became popular for things like speeches, sermons, or boiling your dinner until it resembled something between porridge and regret. And unlike sundials, they worked indoors, in the dark, or during the 74th consecutive rainy day, so they were practically magic by medieval standards. And let's not forget the astronomical clocks, enormous and complex contraptions built into cathedrals later in the Middle Ages. These were less about helping the average person tell time, and more about reminding everyone that God, gears, and gravity were in charge. They displayed the time, moon phases, zodiac signs, and probably your chances of surviving winter. They were beautiful, they were enormous, and they broke a lot. So with all these gadgets, what do we learn? That medieval timekeeping was a grand, gloriously flawed experiment, a blend of nature, ingenuity, and the unshakable belief that maybe this leaky bucket could help us organize our lives. And despite the lack of accuracy, people made it work. Life revolved not around the minute hand but the moment. If the candle burned down to the second mark, it was probably time for supper. If the water pot was empty, maybe head to bed. If the sun came out and your sundial worked, congratulations, you were having a productive day. So the next time you check your phone 37 times an hour, remember this. Medieval folks used sand, wax, and sunlight, and somehow they still managed to show up, mostly on time, to get yelled at by a monk. In the grand medieval symphony of time, two very different instruments were trying to play the lead, the church bell and the market bell. One called you to your knees, the other to your wallet, and much like a lute duet performed by someone with no fingers and someone with no rhythm, the result was often tense. The church had long been the conductor of medieval time. As we saw earlier, monks used the liturgy of the hours to structure their days, and their bells rang with holy authority. To them, time belonged to God, and it was divvied up accordingly. Prayers at dawn, more prayers mid-morning, even more prayers at noon, and so on, until you collapsed in bed spiritually fulfilled and physically exhausted. But then came the rise of towns, merchants, and market stalls, places bustling with bakers, blacksmiths, fishmongers, and people loudly shouting prices while elbow-deep in eels. These folks didn't need spiritual hours. They needed practical ones. When does the market open? When do the city gates close? When is it late enough to drink beer without judgment? This created a glorious clash between two kinds of time, eternal time and economic time. The church operated on celestial rhythms, the townspeople operated on sales, and suddenly everyone had their own clock, and none of them agreed. Let's say you're a shoemaker in 13th century Flanders. You've woken up early, laid out your wares, and just as you're about to strike a deal with a weary traveller, the monastery bell rings terse third hour of the day. Time to pause and reflect. Except across the square the market bell just rang start of trade, and half your customers are already haggling for onions. What do? You sell shoes and ask forgiveness later, or more likely you grumble about how the monks never did a day's work in their lives. The two clocks weren't just ticking on different schedules, they were representing two competing authorities. The church wasn't thrilled about people prioritizing money over mass. and the townspeople weren't thrilled about losing an hour of business because Brother Bartholomew decided it was prayer time again. This disagreement got so intense that many cities installed public clocks, not for accuracy. Those early clocks were charmingly imprecise, but for control. A clock in the town square wasn't just decorative. It was a political statement. This city runs on our time. It was civic pride in gear form. A way to say, you can keep your heavenly schedule, we've got work to do. And these clocks weren't subtle either. They were massive, loud, often beautifully decorated with painted dials, gilded suns and mechanical figurines who danced, rang bells or threw serious shade at the clergy. These weren't just tools, they were timekeeping theatre. But of course, having a giant town clock didn't stop arguments. It just gave people a louder thing to argue about. One city might adjust its clock to ring the hour early, so the market could open before neighboring towns, snatching up trade before anyone else had even set up their turnip displays. Another town might fudge the bell times so curfews started a little later, giving more drinking time before the guards threw everyone out of the tavern. These little acts of clock manipulation created a delightful kind of medieval chaos. It's 6 a.m. according to the bell tower, 7 according to the monastery, and the blacksmith says it's beer o'clock. Naturally, travelers bore the brunt of all this temporal confusion. Arriving in one town meant adjusting not just to new customs but to new time itself. You might leave a village where noon was at 12:15 and enter another where noon was at 1 without crossing a single mountain. The expression being ahead of your time wasn't philosophical, it was geographic. And yet in this noisy tug-of-war between sacred and secular time, something fascinating happened. People began to negotiate time, councils were formed, bell schedules were debated, towns hired official clock keepers whose job it was to maintain the town clock and make sure it didn't make the mayor look like a fool by ringing vespers during lunch. These folks were both artisans and diplomats, because getting time wrong wasn't just annoying, it could lead to conflict, lost income, or even excommunication if you really messed up the prayer bells. It's also worth noting that some towns tried to merge both systems, setting market hours between monastic prayer times or coordinating feast days and trade fairs so that everyone could profit and pray without stepping on toes or toes getting stepped on during aggressive bargaining over cheese wheels. Eventually, as mechanical clocks became more widespread and standardized, the church slowly ceded some ground. Town clocks started to influence monastic life instead of the other way around. Time, once divine and malleable, was becoming civic and structured, and just like that, the countdown to modernity began. So the next time you hear a church bell and glance at your watch, remember, for centuries that sound didn't just mean it's noon, it meant whose noon. And in medieval Europe, that was a question worth arguing about, preferably over ale, turnips, and a very passive-aggressive bell tower. If the medieval world had a personality, it would be equal parts spiritual, chaotic, and incredibly loud, and nothing embodied that better than the birth of the mechanical clock, a device that didn't whisper the time so much as hurl it through the air with the subtlety of a cannonball made of gears. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the old ways of timekeeping, monks counting hours by candle drips and peasants eyeballing the sun, were starting to feel a little imprecise. Europe's cities were growing, trade was booming, and people were no longer content to let the rooster decide their schedules. Enter the mechanical clock. It was big, brassy, bold, and just accurate enough to be wrong in style. These early clocks were nothing like your sleek digital wristwatch or the annoying microwave that beeps until you answer its existential cries. No, these were monumental time-shouting machines, often the size of small rooms, full of swinging weights, spinning wheels, clanking gears, and the occasional clergyman nervously hoping it didn't explode during Mass. And they didn't even have faces at first. That's right, no hands, no numbers, no quarter past anything. They just rang bells at specific intervals. That was it. No visuals, just auditory drama. Every hour on the hour the mechanism would release a hammer which would slam into a bell with all the delicacy of a blacksmith trying to wake the dead. If you were in earshot, congratulations, you now knew something had happened. Was it 3 p.m.? Was it midnight? Who knows? But the bell had spoken, and that was good enough for most. Medieval clocks didn't tell time so much as shout their best guess every hour. The earliest known mechanical clocks emerged in Italian and English cities. Think Milan, Salisbury, and later on Rouen and Strasbourg. And these were no humble gadgets tucked away in libraries. They were installed in cathedrals, town halls, and towering public spaces, as if to announce, "We have conquered time," sort of. It wasn't about subtlety, it was about status. Owning a mechanical clock was like having the medieval version of Wi-Fi in your castle. Loud, glitchy, expensive Wi-Fi. Inside these clocks, the magic was all about the escapement mechanism, a clever little device that regulated the release of energy from a weight-driven gear system, making the clock tick at regular-ish intervals. The earliest versions were known as Verge and Foliot escapements, which, despite sounding like the name of a folk duo, were actually a pair of rotating bars that let gravity do the heavy lifting. Literally, to keep the whole thing running, someone, usually a weary apprentice or underpaid bell ringer, had to wind up the weights every day, dragging stones or metal weights back to the top of the mechanism so it wouldn't just stop dead in the middle of announcing Vespers. If you forgot to wind it, well then time just stopped, and everyone blamed you. Accuracy. Let's not get carried away. These things could drift by 15 minutes or more per day, but in the context of medieval timekeeping, that was basically NASA-level precision. After all, most people still thought of time in chunks. Dawn, mid-morning, afternoon, when the bread smells done, and so forth. So a clock that could vaguely approximate hours without involving livestock or staring at shadows. Revolutionary. But the real selling point wasn't how well it told time. It was how dramatically it told time. Bells could be heard across towns, marking the rhythm of city life. Work, worship, curfew, and chaos. Some clocks even had animated figures, mechanical roosters, saints, demons, or skeletons that would appear and dance or strike bells. It was timekeeping meets theatre, with a splash of existential dread. One famous example is the clock at Wells Cathedral in England, built around 1390, featuring a jousting match between two knights who circle and strike each other on the quarter hour, because nothing says the passage of time like miniature knights engaged in eternal combat. And then there's the astronomical clock in Prague, which included a skeleton ringing a bell to symbolize death. Cheery. Cities began competing to build the most elaborate clocks, sometimes bankrupting themselves in the process. It wasn't just civic pride, it was temporal dominance. If your clock could chime louder and more often than your neighbors, clearly your city was more advanced, more pious, and probably better at brewing beer. And like all things medieval, the political battles were never far behind. Control of the clock often meant control of the daily rhythm of civic life, when shops opened, when curfews began, when you had to stop playing the lute and go home. The church, the merchants, and the city councils all vied for influence over these tick-tocking beasts. Who wound the clock? Who paid for repairs? Who decided if the bell tolled 10 times or 11? These weren't just engineering questions. They were power struggles wrapped in gears. Eventually, clock faces were added with hands and numerals, though good luck reading them from across the muddy square while being jostled by pigs and fishmongers. But once the visual representation of time took root, everything began to change. Suddenly, time wasn't just heard, it was seen, and that visibility gave it a whole new kind of authority. You could lie about the hour, but not when the town clock was looming overhead, reminding everyone that time waits for no man, but it might scream at him once an hour. Long before the age of synchronized world clocks and aggressively punctual airport announcements, time was a local affair, a fiercely independent, wildly inconsistent, and often confusing affair. In the medieval world, there were no time zones. Each village, town, or bustling city had its own version of now, based on one thing and one thing only, where the sun happened to be in their slice of the sky. The result? A patchwork of regional microtimes that made medieval travel feel like crossing invisible time warps with every bump in the road. You see, Time wasn't standardized. There was no universal 12 o'clock. Instead, noon was whenever the sun hit its highest point, directly overhead in that specific place. And since the sun moves across the sky depending on your location, two towns just a few miles apart could be several minutes off from each other, and not in a charming, fashionably late kind of way. In a you missed the market and now there's no cabbage left kind of way. Imagine this. You're a wool merchant leaving town A, where the local sundial said it was 9 a.m. when you departed. After a bumpy ride, a few goat delays, and a cartwheel that decided to retire halfway up a hill, you arrive in town B. But when you get there, they say it's 9:20 a.m. You feel like you time traveled, but only into mild annoyance. You're either early for lunch or suspiciously late for prayers. Either way, you've entered another temporal bubble. This wasn't just a mild inconvenience, it was a way of life. Travelers, messengers, and itinerant monks had to carry not just satchels of letters or holy relics, but mental maps of regional sun behavior. These people were basically walking time converters. They knew that in this valley the sun rose a little later, that on that hill the bell tower liked to ring noon about 10 minutes early, because old brother Felix liked to finish his soup on time, and if you passed 5 villages on your journey, you could experience 5 slightly different noons, all equally confident they were right. If you thought jet lag was bad, try ox cart lag across 5 villages with 5 different noons. Coordination across distances became a headache. Want to set up a meeting between 2 towns? Better double-check whose version of mid-morning you're talking about. Scheduling a wedding or a treaty signing, someone was bound to show up either embarrassingly early or triumphantly late. Diplomats didn't just need translators, they needed time interpreters, and it wasn't just social events. Mail couriers, military operations, traveling judges, and merchant caravans all had to function in a reality where an hour was more of a vibe than a unit. You didn't just ask, "What time is it?" You asked, "According to whom?" Because the guy across the square might point to the church bell and say one thing, while the tannery's sundial stubbornly declared something else entirely. This created some delightful chaos in border regions, where towns competed for trade. A clever town might fudge its bell schedule to open the market earlier than its neighbor, not because time itself changed, just because they said it did. Shady merchants weren't just cheating on weights and prices, they were cooking the clock. Of course, some tried to impose order. Wealthier towns hired clock keepers or time wardens, real titles, not medieval superheroes, who were responsible for maintaining the public clock and making sure it didn't run too fast or too slow. But even then, the issue remained, whose sun are we syncing with? Local pride meant many communities refused to adjust to a neighboring town's idea of noon. That would be admitting someone else's bell was more important. This scattered sense of time persisted for centuries. Even as mechanical clocks spread and improved, they were still set manually, usually by observing the sun at its peak and adjusting accordingly. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the rise of railroads and telegraphs, that people really started to see the problem. A train couldn't run on a schedule if every station had a slightly different idea of when 10 a.m. happened. Missed connections, double bookings, and the occasional confused goat standing on the tracks led to one inevitable conclusion: time needed a makeover. But that's a future headache. In the medieval world, the lack of time zones wasn't seen as strange, it was simply how the world worked. People organized their lives around the rhythm of their own skies, their own bells, their own markets. Time wasn't something you synchronized, it was something you shared with your town, your neighbors, and your favorite sundial. And in a strange way, it worked. People weren't obsessed with minutes and seconds. There was no panicked glance at a wristwatch, no meetings where you were officially late by 3 minutes. Life was a little more flexible, less scheduled, more sunlit. Still, we can't help but marvel at how anyone got anything done. For most of history, humanity treated time the same way it treats leftovers. Everyone had their own version, and it was never quite the same as anyone else's. Noon in one town might be 11:47 a.m. in another, and nobody really argued. because the cows didn't care and the sun didn't send calendar invites. But then along came an invention so powerful, so relentlessly punctual, that it broke the very concept of local time and forced the world to synchronize like an uncomfortable group dance. That invention was the train. Yes, it took steam engines, iron rails, and a few thousand confused passengers to convince the human race that maybe, just maybe, it would be nice if everyone agreed on what time it was. In the medieval world, time was personal. As we've seen, towns rang bells based on their own sunrises, merchants opened stalls when they felt like it, and an hour could stretch depending on how good the bread smelled. But the industrial age didn't have patience for all that charming chaos. It needed precision, order, and above all else, predictability. You can't build a railway empire if every station is living in its own time bubble. Imagine trying to operate a train network in the 1830s. You depart from London, where it's officially 10 a.m., and head to Bristol, where it's somehow 9:58, even though you just spent 2 hours chugging along at top speed. Passengers miss connections, timetables fall apart, and conductors begin to question both their pocket watches and their life choices. In short, local time had met its match. Enter the rise of standardized time. At first the idea was simple: choose one master time, often based on a central city like London, and align all the other clocks to match it. In Britain, this became known as railway time. By the 1840s, rail companies were issuing schedules based on London time, and slowly, often grudgingly, towns and cities across the country began to adjust their clocks to keep up. Churches resisted, shopkeepers grumbled, but once the trains started arriving on time instead of whenever the sun said it was okay, there was no going back. It took trains, steam, and a few global misunderstandings to finally convince humans to agree on lunchtime. But it wasn't just trains. Global navigation also demanded something more reliable than a sundial and a good guess. Sailors needed to know exact time to calculate their longitude at sea. A few minutes off could mean the difference between landing in the right harbor or crashing into a very surprised fishing village. As clocks improved in accuracy, especially with the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century, the world started to wake up to the idea that time could be measured, and not just approximately. Still, the real kicker came in 1884. That year, an international conference met in Washington, D.C., to solve the problem once and for all. What they created was a truly world-altering concept: the time zone. The globe was divided into 24 neatish slices, each one representing an hour of time. At the center was Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, 0 hour, the planet's official wristwatch. Some countries accepted this immediately. Others dragged their feet. France, famously skeptical of British-led anything, continued to use Paris time for years out of sheer spite. But eventually, even the most stubborn clocks gave in. Trains demanded it. Telegraphs demanded it. Global commerce demanded it. The shared fiction of synchronized time became one of the most successful stories humanity ever told. And so the age of subjective time gave way to the age of standard time. Markets now opened on the hour. Factories ran shifts down to the minute. School bells rang with terrifying consistency. And people began living not by the light in the sky, but by the tick-tick of human-made precision. Of course, the transition wasn't always smooth. Entire towns had to adjust their clocks forward or backward by several minutes or even hours. Some places tried to resist. Others adjusted gradually, holding on to their beloved local noon as long as possible. But the writing was on the wall, or more precisely on the railway timetable. The truly wild part: no one in the medieval world saw this coming. The idea that every city, town and village on Earth might one day agree on when it's 3 p.m. would have seemed utterly insane to a 14th century monk still squinting at a candle clock and praying the wax didn't lie. To them, time was divine, seasonal, and deeply local. It wasn't a grid, it was a relationship with nature and the sacred, and yet within a few short centuries, that relationship was replaced by something new: coordinated universal time. It may have taken trains, wars, telegraphs, global trade, and no small amount of yelling, but eventually the world got its clocks to match. So the next time you check your phone and grumble about daylight savings or time zones, just remember, it could be worse. You could be stuck in a cart outside a town that says it's 11:12 when your destination insists it's 11:47, and no one can agree whether the bell is late, the sun is early, or the baker just changed the clock to sell more pies. And with that, our journey through medieval timekeeping comes to an end. From sun shadows to synchronized zones, we've gone from vibes to precision, from bells to satellites, and somehow humans still argue over what time dinner starts.